Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here at the Atlantic Black Sea Security Forum. We are at the most important panel, I think. It's called Illiberal Tendencies in NATO's Political Role. And it's my pleasure to announce the panelists, and of course we will have a few words about the subjects we're discussing today. With us in the panel today, it's Antonia Coliboșanu, Senior Geopolitical Analyst and CEO to Geopolitical Futures. I say hello to Antonia. Ivan Voivoda is Head of Europe Futures Program and Permanent Fellow, Institute for Human Science, Vienna. Ian Lesser, Vice President and Executive Director to German Marshall Fund, United States. And Dan Neculescu, Secretary of State, is a Deputy Foreign Minister to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We are all very preoccupied about these illiberal tendencies, about all the fake news campaign and all the destabilization that's coming from east to the west. And we want to find the answers to the question, what is NATO's political role in order to prevent illiberal tendencies, and how could this be prevented to be an extremist wave in our societies? So I would like to say hello to Antonia Coliboșanu and ask her, what does she think about this new provocation? Are the illiberal tendencies a threat, or are we talking only about ideas that should be preoccupation for our Western civilization. Antonia?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me here. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with such distinguished speakers on the same panel. And to answer the question, I believe that they are a threat. I believe that because since we are speaking about resilience and we are taking resilience seriously at NATO and the EU level, actually, we are taking society seriously with all the aspects, because resilience is basically relating to the force that the society has to stay stable and to react in the same direction as it was before a major event happened. Therefore, fake news and everything related to change of our values and to change of our society culture, if you like, from democracy, from liberalism to illiberalism, is a threat to the stability of the society overall. So yes, by all means, not to mention that there are at least 3 levels where we can talk about the way that not only fake news, but influence and manipulation forces of the entire vectors of society is acting upon the country and acting upon the transatlantic link, if you like. And these are at the socioeconomic level, at the educational level, because obviously with increased digitization, we have more interconnection, and this is very much influencing the way that our children are raised and the values that they have, which is at the very core of what happens next to our societies. And ultimately, we need to refer to those very specific gaps within society, gaps between classes, between communities, between urban and rural, that we are having increased because of our economic problems, but also due to all these factors that are increasingly manipulating and influencing the way that our societies are built to resist.
Thank you, Antonia. We'll go now to Ian Lesser, and I want to ask him what is his perspective from German Marshall Fund, US. Is this illiberal tendency somehow a good role for NATO? Do you think we must address, we must fight, we must analyze? What is the best approach that the alliance could have?
Roger, thank you very much. Of course, these are my views. They're not GMF's, but these are issues that GMF as an institution, obviously takes very, very seriously in our work on geopolitics or civil society. I mean, just to say a couple of things, I think when you think about this this challenge in the context of NATO, there are at least 2 dimensions that we can think about. We can think about, how it affects the security environment broadly that NATO has to respond to, and security partnerships, but it also affects affects members directly. And there are, as we know, things happening even within NATO itself that call into question some of the values side of the relationship. I mean, if you go back and actually look at the North Atlantic Treaty signed in 1949, it's in the preamble, it actually talks directly about this. It talks about the importance of values, of democracy, of human rights, it makes specific reference to liberalism, in fact. And so, these things are embedded in the treaty. It's embedded in the alliance. I think NATO, looking internally, has some challenges here, because one of the problems with the rise not only of anti-democratic movements, but also populist movements and nationalist movements, is that there's a tendency to portray alliances like NATO as elite projects. And this becomes a target for political movements with other kinds of agendas. And, you know, we've seen that in many, many places, including, I would say, in my own country, in the United States. There was some of this in the Trump administration's approach to NATO. You know, the system held in that case, I would say. But nonetheless, if you think about what Marine Le Pen has said recently about NATO and her intent to withdraw France from the integrated military command and so on, it's in part because, you know, movements like this are very well aware that NATO is an elite institution and very open to criticism. I mean, a second point I would make, and it's more about the security environment, is that you know, this can really be a complicating factor, not only in the kind of threats that the alliance faces, but how you deal with them. How you define terrorism, for example, in a world in which there is a blurring of the distinction between internal and external security, and much of this is driven by identity arguments and the need for, in some cases, even regime survival. I'm thinking outside of NATO here. It makes it very, very difficult and complicates the world that NATO faces. And it has crisis management implications as well. The kind of disinformation that we're seeing, the speed with which this can spread complicates things and can suggest that things can fall apart very, very quickly and can be, in a way, magnified by malign attempts to influence information in society. And then finally, you know, it seems to me that that if we're going to think about this in the broadest sense, if you're going to have a more political NATO, then one of these things will be how you deal with the big picture issues in the global security environment. And certainly one of those big picture issues will be not only the rise of authoritarianism and liberal tendencies, but also the tendency of many leading regimes in this space, China and Russia in particular, to conceive of a kind of alternative global order that does not play by the same rules, that does not share the same values. And so I would just conclude by saying that for NATO, it's not just a matter of defending territory. It seems to me it's also a matter of defending values inside our societies and projecting those out as well.
Thank you so much, Ian. We're going now to Dan Nicolaescu, who is a Deputy Foreign Minister.
Yes. Do you hear me, Radu?
Yes, I'm hearing.
Well, I am hidden behind a black wall because I think some technicians here forgot some passwords. I'm really sorry about that. But when we talk about illiberalism and we talk about extremism, this is what happens, right?
Exactly. Maybe it's a cyber attack than we experience in live. So we are fighting. We are with you anyway.
I hope not. I hope not. I'm fine. Thank you very much for this invitation. Thank you very much for the discussion. It's a very interesting one. I'm very pleased to participate. Also because, as you mentioned, and I want to also raise the awareness about that, we have been engaged, Romania, in the recent a month or so on many activities which proved very useful in preparation of the summit. And I'm talking about the trilateral, the Bucharest format summit. And today, further in the day, we're going to assist to the new the grand opening of the Euro-Atlantic Center for Resilience in Bucharest. So I will very, very fast address some of the issues that you mentioned, if you allow me. First, I would like to say that the summit in 2 weeks is a very relevant one, not only because it's the first to be attended by by the new president of the United States, but also because it will take relevant decisions about the future of NATO. I would like also to point out, before I get into the discussion about liberalism and extremism, that Romania is very much interested that this summit continues to consolidate deterrence and defense posture, and that the military transformation of NATO continues. We are very much interested in that because we have witnessed recently the Russian Federation military buildup and all the threats that emanate not only from that, but also from the broader perspective of the Black Sea. The Minister Aurescu recently, promoted and discussed in the EU context the fact that protracted conflicts are still a menace for the security of the region. Therefore, we are very much interested that deterrence and defense posture of the alliance continues. Now, thirdly, I truly believe that the risk emanating from illiberalism and extremism will be tackled at least in 2 separate ways by NATO. I wouldn't say directly, head on, but when consolidating resilience, this is a very important aspect of the agenda of the summit in 2 weeks. Consolidating resilience. And in this case, I think resilience means also resisting to illiberalism and extremist tendencies. I can inform you that we pay a lot of attention to that because, as I mentioned, later in the day, we're going to inaugurate the Euro-Atlantic Center for Resilience, and we're going to have a lot of things going on under this auspices of this center. One of them would be to tackle the societal resilience, which deals exactly with that. Therefore, we are very much interested. We are aware that NATO would take this on board, and Romania is very much active in this respect, so we can contribute to NATO discussions. Second, we know that already, that in 2 weeks, the leaders will give us a mandate to start negotiating a new strategic concept. This will take us at least a year, I hope only 1 year, to be very, sarcastic with the situation in NATO. But I hope in 1 year we're going to have a broader common perspective. And here I believe the idea of illiberalism and extremism should be tackled. And I'm sure Romania and other countries and other allies will have that in mind when discussing, when negotiating how we're going to see the new strategic concept. Again, some say it's going to be an updating. I prefer to say it's going to be a new strategic concept, because the one that we have in 2010 is already outdated. However, to my mind, there are also other ways in which NATO already contributes to strengthening our common values. First, I think it's cooperation with partners. Here, I think some of you know about this initiative that NATO launched, which is called Building Integrity, which is a very important one because it allows transparent and accountable defense institutions in the partner countries, which is a modest way of saying we also contribute to stopping illiberalism and stopping, extremism. On the same token, I think one of the most important things that the alliance will probably be very active in, it's restating the importance, actually, of the transatlantic link, which always comes with values. I mean, to my mind, when we talk about the transatlantic community, we talk about values, which is democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. The only ones that can fight efficiently the tendencies that you mentioned. Thank you very much. And I leave it here, and I'm going to engage in discussion.
Thank you, Minister Nicolescu. Very interesting view from the eastern flank. It was a song in my youth. It's called Vienna Calling. So we go to Ivan Voivoda, and I want to ask you, Ivan, what can we do to empower NATO's political role in fighting illiberalism?
Thank you very much, Radu, and just a thank you to Mircea Joana and Alina Inae, who have been spearheading this Atlantic Security Forum for a number of years, and I'm sure, as everyone else, sorry not to be in Bucharest with you all. This is an extremely important topic and a challenging one, since, of course, after the fall of the wall, we didn't expect that we would have regressive tendencies on these issues, both in the Euro-Atlantic arena, which means both NATO and the European Union. And the fact that we have countries, and I will not shy away from mentioning them, of the likes of Turkey or Hungary, where media freedom is being challenged and where society is resilient and fighting back, it is of immense importance that NATO and I add the European Union need to confront this issue head on, because it's about the credibility of these organizations. And in particular, often people colloquially think of NATO as a military alliance, and I think Ian underscored very well the fact that it is a political alliance first and foremost, and then it has all the other security and defense aspects. And I think that NATO has, in a sense, challenged these issues. The whole question of resilience has come up also in the European Union strategic concept. It's back, and what State Secretary Nicolescu has said, I think it's very heartening. The opening of this center in Bucharest is extremely important. And Antonia mentioned education. We know from various studies that, for example, Finland is most resilient to fake news, and the reason is the education that people from a young age are exposed to a variety of examples of how this happens, and simply fake news doesn't stick, if I can put it that way, to Finnish citizens of various ways. I would add a dimension that we haven't mentioned here, and that is corruption, the fight against corruption. President Biden has put a strong accent on this, others. This is a phenomenon that undermines values just as badly as identity issues or identitarian politics or terrorism. And I would say that adding this dimension, and we have seen in post-communist countries, if we still call them that, the long battle to address something that has become systemic. There are elements of state capture that have needed to be addressed, and so this compound of issues, I think, is something that is key. And I would add that, to finish, the fact that NATO has been enlarging, that North Macedonia, from the region where I heart from, has become the 30th member, is an important way in which political stability, the Euro-Atlantic umbrella, comes over it. And the fact that Greece and Turkey are members of NATO means that there is somewhere, a break to a possibility, even where strong tensions of various geopolitical kinds exist. And so I think the announcement of a new strategic concept, as State Secretary said, is important. We remember, Ian and I, the 2010, when our late colleague Ron Asmus was one of the people that worked on that prior concept. So as State Secretary said, it is time for a new one, which will have these elements that we are talking about here.
Thank you, Ivan. Thank you, Antonia. Thank you, Ian and Dan. Now we are going to a small debate between us, and I will happily receive some questions from you if there are some. It seems that we are going back to the principles, to the basic principles mentioned in the Washington Treaty in 1949. We have 72 years of the most successful political military alliance in the history, but right now we are facing threats that brings us to the basic values mentioned in the treaty. And I want to read the definition of the hybrid threats we are facing, coming exactly from NATO. Look what the alliance says about the hybrid threats. Hybrid threats combine military and non-military, as well as covert and overt means, including disinformation, cyber attacks, economic pressure, deployment of irregular armed groups, and use of regular forces. Hybrid methods are used to blur the lines between war and peace and attempt to sow doubt in the minds of target populations. They aim to destabilize and undermine societies. So, with this definition, I want to invite you all to a debate, and I will want to ask Deputy Minister Nicolescu, does Romania have a certain expertise on fighting those kind of threats based on our experience in the Cold War? Are we here in the first line on the eastern flank with a better radar and perception when we are talking about dictatorship, illiberalism, and fake news?
Yes, thank you, Radu, for this question. I must admit, I think I'm not sure that this NATO definition is quite the most extensive. Actually, I don't think there is a agreed definition of hybrid. I would say also, and I would add to what you have said, the fact that all these things are meant to make the assailant more difficult to identify, because that's the threat that we are now facing. We know that there are attacks, but we don't know for sure, and it's very difficult to prove who is behind those attacks. And for activating Article 5 or all this beautiful alliance of ours, it also takes a very important who's the assailant. Coming to your question, nevertheless, is yes, we have this expertise. I think the fact that we are still one of the countries in the region and in NATO who has a very high approval of NATO membership shows you that the values that you've been talking about, democracy, rule of law, human rights, fighting corruption, are still vivid. In a society where all these things are alive, it's easier to identify, the sleeping cells acting, behind some of the news that we receive. I wouldn't go to say that we still have the experience of the Cold War, because I think much has been since then. 30 years, it's almost a generation. I think I don't say we have the expertise because of the Cold War, but I think there are many aspects and arguments. One of them, including by the fact that our history with the main power in the region, which is Russia, has been so difficult, made us stronger and easier. Make us more aware where to look and how to look to many of the aspects of this, let's say, hybrid attacks. So yes, we are a bit more prepared, but I wouldn't say that this will last forever. We have to continue equip and invest in education. We have to continue to invest in, knowledge, and this is why this Euro-Atlantic Center for Resilience, to us, it's been a very good decision, because it's at least a small guarantee that we will continue to look and not be complacent. Because the things that we have seen recently, it's a more, we have witnessed, including in Romania, a more refined way and method of, influencing our political life, our way of life. So therefore, we do have, to answer in the short, we do have expertise. There is also something in the blood that, recommends us. But at the same time, we do not have to be certain that this will last forever. We have to already invest in what we now have to make sure that we stay protected in the future.
Thank you, Minister Nicolescu. Antonia, it says in this definition that the hybrid war aimed to destabilize the minds of populations. Do we have to create a mind department in NATO?
That's a very interesting question. We have to look at NATO and the way it evolved as we evolved with it, I believe. In other words, during the Cold War, NATO was primarily a military alliance. Now we have primarily a political alliance. However, we must not forget what won the Cold War for us. It was the inspiration of focusing on those values and of those elements in the socioeconomic environment that proved we are superior, as the transatlantic link was superior. Romania at that time was on the other side, of course, but when the Cold War ended, the post-communist states wanted to be in NATO because that was primarily a superior force. Then it was something that protected us. We saw NATO as a protective force. And that inspirational factor that NATO had then was very important for the enlargement of NATO and for its PR, if you will. That was what created the mind department in NATO. That very inspiration that made me, a very young person back then, hope for a better life, because we were no longer fighting with the USSR. And the Cold War was over, and there was a where I could communicate with people in the US. I could learn more about what liberalism is, and I could have access to education about capitalism, about a system of freedom, essentially. And all of these aspirations were basically what founded that mindset this time. I believe that we need to find inspiration for what comes after, because we are now forced to accelerate policies. We are now forced to go into solving many problems, going from socioeconomic problems of great urgency that the pandemic created, supply chains effectiveness. How do we make it so that we are sure that we get the pills that we depend on as human beings faster in a crisis situation like the pandemic? That's a very tactical element. Then we have climate change. That is a strategic element to have to look at. And we have all sorts of ideas of policies. But while we are accelerating, we need to make certain that all these policies do not make us dependent on factors that are not for us to control. In other words, what are the materials that we need to bring these stuff together? What kind of elements of educational demographics do we need in NATO? And this is where education, I think, coming back to your question about mind department, this is why education really matters. It's about looking honestly at our demographic, understanding the needs, understanding the problems, and understanding what we need to do next. Because we are fully integrated. We're probably at the transatlantic level. We're probably the most modern society in the entire world right now. So what do we do with that? Because our threat is no longer the USSR. Our threat is more complicated than that. In fact, it is kind of switching. We had emergent powers like China coming in. We have all kinds of reasons to believe that the Black Sea is going to be the geopolitical node of Eurasia again, with Russia rising, but also with Russia being threatened by socioeconomic issues that are similar to ours. So our problems are more complex, and our children, our youth is more integrated. They understand more than we do on some issues, especially on technology, I might say. So what exactly and how do we need to adapt to the next generation for us to keep those values that inspired what we are today, which is a transatlantic community? So I think that is the key question to begin with when solving your big question about the mind department of NATO. Finding the inspiration, and how we find that will tell us what our mind department of tomorrow will look like.
Thank you, Antonia. I want to go to Ian and ask him, is this illiberal tendency part of the hybrid war? Because our discussions started years ago talking about tendencies. Now, illiberal is a threat. And from the threat, it's probably growing to a political movement, and from a political movement, it will be an illiberal state decision. And that fights our values in the Western world. So, illiberal tendencies are part of the hybrid war?
Well, Radu, I think the two phenomena, in a sense, go together and can reinforce one another. They're obviously not the same. On the hybrid warfare part, I mean, this is a very real challenge, obviously, but it's of course nothing new in the world. It is a facet of warfare that's as old as war, and whether it's kinetic conflict combined with other things, or it's a sort of war undertaken by other means. This is not new in any sense, from the use of proxies to the use of information warfare to the use of propaganda. All of these things we've seen in the past. The difference, of course, is that technology gives you the capacity to accelerate these things, and it gives it pace and reach, which it never had in the past. And so, this is something to note. At the same time, of course, societies trying to defend themselves from these phenomena also have a far greater ability to see these things. They're hard to see sometimes, but we shouldn't also underestimate our ability to make many of these risks transparent. I mean, we can get very, very good at that indeed. The question is whether, in some cases, for example, in the cyber area, you may well have a very good idea of who the perpetrator is, but you have to think through very carefully the sort of deterrence and stability implications of actually naming them. So there is a part of this that's also about our own calculus and our own strategy. It's not necessarily the technical problem, although it is in some cases. I think the phenomenon of illiberalism can affect the alliance in another way. It's more subtle, but it can be actually very important. In the case of an Article 5 contingency, I don't think alliance members are going to ask too many questions about the state of politics inside, an alliance member under attack. But in fact, the world is a lot more complicated than that. And many of the contingencies NATO has faced, will face in the future, will not necessarily be of that kind. They will be of exactly this kind that comes out of, sort of hybrid strategies, gray areas, things where it's not so clear whether there will be alliance solidarity or not. And it seems to me, if we're not on the same page within the alliance when it comes to values, perceptions, behaviors, human rights, democracy, media freedoms, all of these things, it's going to be harder to mobilize societies in support of partnership when security is threatened, short of these, clear-cut Article 5 kind of situations. Look at the debate that's gone on with Turkey on some of the very real security challenges it faces. But Turkey has a harder time making its case because in many cases we've lost trust, in Ankara for reasons that may be unrelated to NATO, but affect that calculus. So, these things, to go back to your question, I think relate to one another. They're not precisely the same thing, but it's a complicated equation, obviously.
Thank you, Ian. And I want to go back to Ivan and ask him, Ivan, do you think we need to renew our engagements after 72 years of successful NATO? Do you think we have to re-empower the basic rules mentioned in the Washington Treaty? We can hear you.
Yes, I agree, but at the same time, I don't think they've ever gone away. I think we had the illusion of the end of history after '89, and somehow we thought that it would be smooth sailing from now on, and that basically it would be minor issues and threats and challenges. Lo and behold, of course, with the financial crisis at the end of the 2000s and the migration crisis and Russia's annexation of Crimea and invasion of Georgia before that, and then all the hybridity that all the colleagues have mentioned here, the complicated issues have brought this to our attention, and we see that history is not only back, but it's back with a vengeance. So that is why we are having this discussion. I think it's important to say, when we're talking about illiberalism or authoritarian regimes that are, beyond this continent here, the aim is to undermine values, to undermine democracy, and to show the weakness of democracy, and to try and overturn societal and economic dynamics that we have witnessed. And I think, as Ian said at the very beginning, there are countries that want to change the way the world works, on the way the world is shaped. We thought that, by China coming into the World Trade Organization, by countries adhering to similar rules, somehow there would be a softening, at least in the international arena, of these big questions, not specifically, internally. There's no expectation that China will change its system, but somehow that it would be a partner in bigger issues. And yet, having mentioned that, of course, that we need a China and a Russia when we're tackling the question of climate change. And so, the question of the mindset is one that is attempted to be undermined by these questions, muddying the waters, trying to show that there's a confusion in values, that there's hypocrisy, that there are double standards, and somehow people then, because of the way that the media works, the 24 news hour cycle, all of that, and then regimes or leaders who are not out there in front defending their values or fighting for them. And that's why the title of the panel of NATO's political role is so fundamental, because it needs to, one needs to repeat these things. One cannot take them for granted. One needs to wake up every day and, to put it simply, repeat them, and to create the structures of which we have mentioned many here that need to be upfront in tackling them in the various arenas, whether it's cyber, whether it's media, whether it's education, whether it's in the economy, whether it's in, following the money and the corruption that is occurring, that we can then somehow, this is what renewal of the principles and the values really is about.
Very interesting, Ivan. Now I have a single question for all of you, and I want to start with Minister Nicolaescu. Are you still with us, yes?
Roger that.
Yes. Minister Nicolaescu, what should NATO 2030 concept and the new strategic concept should be mentioning about hybrid threats and illiberal tendencies? And what do you expect from the summit that is taking place in 14th of June?
Let me start with the latter, which is simpler. The latter question. I expect at the summit in June, solidarity to make sense, to be underpinned once again. I expect cohesive and coherent NATO communique, which will show that NATO continues to be, as you mentioned, the most successful alliance, and also that NATO has the means and the ways to reject all the threats and the risks that are posed 360 degrees. Of course, we're going to be much more interested about the threats and risks in the wider Black Sea region, but to be fair to everyone, I think NATO is a very relevant organization and should also look global. And I think this is coming to the first question. I don't think at this stage, I believe that the new strategic concept should mention the risks of illiberalism and the extremists. But at the same time, I think the new strategic concept should put a much more emphasis on all the values that unite us, because I think this is very important, to stress the positive side of it. And I think solidarity, transatlantic link, the fact that we are united in values count a lot. So I would expect the concept to restate those and put it even higher in the hierarchy than before. And I also expect that the new concept tackle also these threats that you mentioned, the risks of illiberalism and extremism, and make sure that because of the discussions today, we also in the Romanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs have some ideas how to reflect that in the debates. Of course, it's too early now. We have to see the terms of reference. We have to see how the negotiations are handled. But make no mistake, this is not only Romania. There are many allies who believe that our values should be restated and believe that in the new strategic concept, these things should be mentioned as risks. So I'm fairly confident, fairly optimistic that, we're going to see those in the new strategic concept. About the expectation in the summit, I think I mentioned solidarity, cohesiveness, transatlantic link, but also the fact that I mentioned at the beginning, for Romania, it's extremely important to see that the deterrence and defense posture continues. Again, while we pay a lot of attention to the hybrid techniques, to all these things that you mentioned today, which are, as Mr. Lesser mentioned, affect or sometimes do not affect the alliance when it comes to crucial decisions. Nevertheless, I want to restate the fact that we are very interested in seeing that this defense and deterrence and defense posture continues, because the threats, the security threats are real and we have seen them on the ground. while keeping focus on that, we have to develop also ways to tackle the new emerging threats. And here are the liberalism and also, extremist tendencies. So I think that's more or less in a nutshell my ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. I understood that you have to leave. You have a meeting, so I want to thank you.
Thank you very much. I was the president of the military at the NATO military committee.
We are both waiting for him here, and thank you, Minister Nicolaescu. Antonia Coliboșanu, if you all get a call from NATO Secretary General, which is not impossible, my guess, and he will ask your advice, what should be mentioned in the NATO 2030 framework and in the new strategic concept about hybrid threats, illiberal tendencies, what will you say to him?
Well, focus on the role that NATO had for generations. Focus on the value aspects of NATO. That is what counters any hybrid tactics that affect the way that we think as a population, while also being careful and understanding the demographic of NATO today. I would also emphasize on demographic, because we are in a process of, in effect, reindustrialization, basically. Climate change forces us to do that, and the problems that we had on the global supply chain also forces to reindustrialize our economy. And that basically underlines why NATO needs to go global, basically. Focus on its global role of an international organization that, while underlines the transatlantic link, understands that the threats are coming from all over the world and also from within. So that's basically what, I don't know if I would say, because I'm saying it publicly here, I would stress for the next concept, if I were in a position to stress that. But fortunately, I'm in an academic position and an analyst position, so I will look forward to see the text and analyze it.
Yes, thank God the big pressure is not on us. So, Ian, when I saw your smile, I guess you have the solution for this final communique in the NATO summit, and also a very good advice for NATO 2030 framework and the new strategic concept.
Well, Radu, thank you. I was smiling at Antonia's comment about the analysis side of this, because that's also extremely interesting, in fact, and is a service, in fact, to NATO to assess these things. But just to say a couple of things, there will be a start of a kind of review of the strategic concept, and that's important to do for all the reasons that we know. I mean, just a couple of points. I think, first of all, the minister mentioned this, I think, in all of this discussion about resilience and narratives and hybrid forms and all of these other things, we also can't lose track of the sort of basics here of deterrence and defense, because in fact, those things aren't going away. I mean, there is a hard power side to what NATO has to deal with. And if you don't do that, then societies will lose confidence. And I think it does matter. It's not just about that, obviously. I mean, everybody, you hear this sort of discourse everywhere now, whether there's different vocabulary associated with it, say in the United States or France, but basically there's not so much difference between what President Biden calls for as a middle-class foreign policy on the one hand, and when President Macron talks about a France that protects. I mean, you see this everywhere, and the pandemic, I think, has only sort of deepened this concern on the part of societies. They want to be protected, so we have to be aware of those things, and there will be a spectrum of risks against which they will need to be protected, and that's the NATO business. Another point would be about burden sharing, which is a slightly different topic, but it relates to this because I think the Biden administration comes to this, I think this will be welcomed in many quarters in Europe, with no less attention to the problem of what Europe is doing relative to the United States, but a less orthodox view about how to measure it. That it's not necessarily all about defense spending and percentages, although those are important. It's also about what countries bring to the table. And many of the things we've been talking about are in fact real contributions to defense, but they don't get put in the 2% number. Intelligence sharing, internal security, what countries do in the way of resilience and narratives and all the rest of it. This also is a contribution. And I think there will be a certain openness to sort of looking at that. And then just finally, I think this, we've talked about it as well, this idea of kind of reinvigorating the political side of what NATO does. You know, making NATO, you know, one of the key places where the big picture issues of the day are discussed by alliance members. And I think that sometimes gets forgotten. And I think that could be reinforced in this NATO 2030 exercise. But thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be part of the conversation.
Thank you, Ian. My pleasure also. I think it's the best panel until now. Ivan, is this illiberal tendency in this hybrid war the nuclear non-military threat to the alliance?
Well, certainly. I mean, it comes with all the other threats that have been mentioned, definitely. And we have to be well aware of the ways in which there has been a multiplication of those various threats as we have moved along. Since this seems to be the last round, I'd just like to go to a point that Antonia made about, you know, these countries coming out from the cold and into the quote unquote warmer spheres of joining a democratic liberal alliance. You know, the country where I was born, which doesn't exist anymore, called Yugoslavia, and that is today 7 countries. Of those 7 countries, 4 have already joined NATO. Slovenia, Croatia, North Macedonia, and Montenegro. 3 haven't. And I'd like to underscore the fact we've heard from Russian leaders very often that these countries are being forced into NATO. You know, this rhetoric coming from Moscow. No, these countries have joined of their own free will for all the reasons that Antonia earlier mentioned. Finally, the wall came down, and you know, the illiberalism disappeared, if I can put it that simply, or the dictatorship and totalitarianism. And so there's been a steady move to basically underscore and buttress those values from the eastern flank broadly writ. And you know, if we talk about that strategic document that's forthcoming in the years to come, I think that's something that needs to be underscored, that there has been a realization that, you know, these basic values of human rights, of freedom, of rule of law, etc., are what people want. And this is, you know, where we come to the contemporaneity of this problem. We have had a backsliding in a certain number of these countries, and yet, you know, the public opinion polls show huge support still for NATO, for the European Union. And let's be clear, we have had democratic mayors elected in Istanbul, in Budapest, in Warsaw. And so things are not black and white, you know, in terms of illiberalism, and the resilience of society and of voters in political terms is there. And so I think we have something to work with, if I can be very simple about it. And, you know, finally, when it comes to the summit that we are, you know, looking forward to in 2 weeks, I think solidarity that Dan Nicolaescu mentioned is key. And just let me remind also from this part of the world where I come from, NATO plays an extremely important role in peacekeeping in Kosovo. There are about 5,000 NATO troops from a diversity of countries that are both NATO and non-NATO. and they are important to both the majority Albanian community and to the Serbian community. There is NATO in Bosnia still. There's a command. Yeah, it's a small contingent, but I think those are elements that show how NATO in practical terms espouses these values and helps other nations to try and keep stability, peace, but obviously the other democratic elements of that. So the military aspect clearly that everyone has mentioned of deterrence and defense is crucial. And I would say something that I think we've much discussed. Obviously, it's not about only about the quantity of money that's put in, but how do we integrate the defense capacities, and so that we have a distribution and a division of labor here, and not to have every country have everything, because there are limited resources in defense terms and all other aspects of security. And I think a much greater effort needs to be done in that direction.
Thank you very much, Ivan. I learned from you that you've mentioned 3 states where we all can see illiberal tendencies and even decisions right on the top of the government of these 3 NATO countries. So I would like to draw conclusions with all of you. And Antonia, are you rather pessimistic or optimistic that we in the Western world, in NATO, we can defeat illiberalism, or it will spread like a disease?
I'm optimistic that we will evolve in NATO and in our own society. So in other words, I'm optimistic that if we manage to fight back illiberalism within the member states of NATO, then we will become together resilient. But yes, considering the fact that we have this conversation, that's proof that we have a foundation for optimism, at least.
Yes, thank you. Ian, are you rather optimistic or pessimistic? And I want you to take in consideration also the first attack in the history to the US Capitol in Washington, D.C.
Well, look, you're right. I mean, September 11th was the only Article 5 contingency NATO has ever had. And it just underscores how important it is to have this sense of solidarity that was mentioned earlier, a sense of cohesion, a sense of responsibility. NATO didn't have to take that decision. The United States could have addressed that issue on its own, but it was hugely meaningful that the alliance did take that decision, and it did become an Article 5 commitment for the alliance. I mean, that's important. I don't think any member of the alliance can dismiss the possibility that it could face such things in the future. And I think the judgments about that kind of solidarity will inevitably be influenced by the kinds of governments we have, what societies think, by public opinion. And if Ivan is right that at the end of the day, people really do want to see sort of the benefits of a liberal society, I think they're also going to want to see NATO be in the business of helping to defend that. I think on the whole, I'm very optimistic. I won't address the question of where the world is going in terms of liberalism and authoritarianism and who's going to triumph in the end. But in terms of NATO's own role, I am optimistic. I do think NATO, even within the alliance, even with the kinds of factors you mentioned, in a sense, takes the edges off. Ivan referred earlier to the relationship between Greece and Turkey, which is very unstable in many respects, but having this NATO connection helps a great deal, and it also influences the way societies think, and that's part of the equation too. I mean, public opinion does matter. So I guess that's a bit of an optimistic note from my side.
Thank you, Ian. Ivan, Antonia, and Ian are so optimistic. What about you?
Well, I share their views. I would simply add that this is, I think, I speak for us all, it's cautious optimism, obviously, because, who knows where history goes. But I think, if we consider this kind of the long wave and the longue durée, as French historians say, then, people have come back and have fought against the greatest challenges and adversities. And the 20th century is fortunately and unfortunately the best example of how societies and states come back from really the deepest black holes of their history. And unfortunately, we have had to learn that evil comes back, that the bad dynamics of politics and society are out there lurking and can hit us on the head like a boomerang. Unfortunately, I had to witness that in my country, both as a citizen, as a social scientist who didn't see it coming, because why in Europe would someone do that at the end of the 20th century, and yet we did it to ourselves. And so I've looked at things and analyzed them very, very cautiously. But I think, given the dynamics that we have seen in the member states, and that's why I on purpose mentioned the capital cities or the main cities of these countries, where people, voters, have risen to the challenge of fighting back those illiberal tendencies. So I'm also sure that we will see a positive dynamic in the years to come. Whether we see a kind of a de-regression, if I can put it that way, of those illiberal tendencies in a year or two or three, that is hard to gauge, but I'm certain that we will see it.
Thank you, Ivan. I'm so sorry that such an optimistic panel should end here. Our time is up. I want to thank you all, Antonia Coliboșanu, Ivan Voivoda, Ian Lesser, and Dan Nicolaescu. So illiberal tendencies are here. They are not far away. We must take strong actions. And of course, the first to react is NATO. Thank you all. See you in the next panel.
Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome to our next panel, Emerging and Disruptive Technologies and the New Definition of Security. It's becoming increasingly clear that the definition of security has transformed to denote a global, comprehensive construct. The traditional security paradigm often no longer applies. We are now facing a diverse range of global threats like cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, pandemics, and environmental disasters. Emerging and disruptive technologies are supercharging the gray zone, the conflicts that are just below full combat, full war. From deepfakes to stealing data and dumping it publicly to embarrass a political enemy, just like Russia allegedly dumped emails that embarrassed Hillary Clinton and just possibly cost her the 2016 election. These new techniques and tactics are here to stay. Yet the recent buildup of Russian troops on the Ukrainian border shows we still have to be ready for conventional war. Now, here to discuss these increasingly complex challenges, we have David Van Vel, Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO, joining us virtually. We have Simona Cojucaru, the State Secretary at the Ministry of National Defense of Romania. We have Jamie Shea, Professor of Strategy and Security at the University of Exeter, and the former Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO. And we have Jarno Limnel, Professor of Practice Cybersecurity at Aalto University and Adjunct Professor of Cybersecurity Leadership at the National Defense University in Finland. Now, I'm going to try to keep this moving along, even though some of us are virtual and 2 of us are in person. So I'll be keeping an eye out for my panelists who are virtual if they want to jump in with any comments. And I'm going to start out with my favorite technique is a lightning round, where I ask each of the panelists to answer a question that is challenging off the top of their head and say in under 3 minutes. So I'm going to start with the minister in the room. What is the biggest emerging technology threat that you obsess over right now? And what is the most immediate solution you can think of to combat it?
Thank you very much, Kimberly. First, I would like to say that it's great to be here in person, and I would like to salute other distinguished panelists virtually, so it's good to be here. And I'm grateful to Aspen Institute Romania and German Marshall Fund of the United States Bucharest Office for organizing this edition of the forum. So it's important to have this kind of events. So thank you very much for the question, and I would like to say that first, COVID-19 was or is still the biggest shocks in generations. And it is clear that today we have to understand the security concerns, be it conventional, be it hybrid, be it part of the emerging and disruptive technologies. I would like to say for the beginning that time is not on our side on technological progress. This is crystal clear. So I think we are witnessing a breakneck speed of innovation with emerging technologies. So I think this is the real challenge or the real threat, the incredible fast of changes in the emerging and the disruptive technologies. This is, to my mind, the clue.
The moment you have a solution, it's already outdated.
Yes, something
especially
like
at the speed
something like
government
that.
moves.
So again, we here in Romania, we are very much concerned about the domain. We are doing efforts, you know, in trying to be part of the game. And also we are following with very much interest, and we are part of the debates in NATO and the EU on this topic. And moreover, again, we are very much conscious that we have a window of opportunity right now, and we have to be on board.
Well, with that, let's go to NATO and Assistant Secretary Van Vel. What do you see as the leading threat that you obsess over that's keeping you up at night? Can we hear Secretary Van Vel? So everyone can hear me. Awesome. Who wants to jump in then with the leading threat that they're facing? Jamie, how about you?
Should I continue?
I just want to see, can we hear the audio of the other panelists? I guess while we sort out the audio with our three panelists virtually, we'll take advantage of the fact that we're right here. So
it's good to be in person.
Exactly.
So it's
get vaccinated, get traveling. In terms of when you think of things like disinformation, AI, deep fakes, what are the things, what is the leading thing that you're focusing, that's in your inbox every morning?
Yes. So I have to say that these new hybrid threats or emerging and disruptive technologies have the power to change our lives, our way to think, our way to communicate, our way to relate with privacy. So it's very, very important. And as I said, Romania is doing a lot. We have mentioned and we inserted in the strategic documents like the National Defense Strategy 2020-2024, in the white paper on defense, in the strategic defense review that we conducted at the level of the Ministry of Defense, provisions in relation with all these new challenges, as you said, artificial intelligence, quantum, big data, deepfake, 5G, digitalization. So there is a plethora of challenges, and we have, as I said, to be part of the game. To my mind, it's very important, for instance, that NATO, through the reflection process, NATO 2030, launched by the NATO Secretary General last year, it's focusing on the new challenges. And we have an ongoing process of defining a strategic concept. And also in EU, we are now undergoing a process to develop a strategic compass. So there are a lot of evolutions, and we think it's important to maintain undamaged the values, purposes, credibility of our institutions. So my one message from my part is that we need to address this in complementarity, NATO and EU together. This is one of the messages. The second one is related to the fact that 30 allies are looking to 2030. So it's quite symbolic, and we are going to have very soon a summit of our leaders in Brussels. So also this issue should be quite high on the agenda, although, it has to go in full synergy with all the important tasks that the Alliance is performing right now, like deterrence and defense posture, on the eastern flank, like threats coming from the east, threats coming from the south, in that 360 approach. This is a very important issue. And yes,
I was just going to say, so you did mention coordinating and NATO, and it turns out that we have coordinated a way to hear their audio. So I would like to turn to Mr. Van Vel and ask him to chime in, if you can, with what you worry about and an immediate solution to it, and then go from there.
No, thank you, Kimberly, and I hope you can hear me now.
Can do.
Great, and I'd love to travel and be there. I am vaccinated, so be sure that I'll be there next year. I try not to stay awake at night and catch my sleep. And I do think that we approach this theme from a comfortable leading position as Alliance, in where we still have the leading edge in the Western world when it comes down to developing technology, in owning innovation. However, there is a link missing, and that's one of the links that we're trying to address. And that is that as a defense sector, we've been kind of separated from the place where the real innovation at this time happens. So where 40, 50 years ago, it would be the defense sector leading all these technology changes. Now you see that it happens in the private sector. It happens in academia. It happens not with the large defense contracting companies, but it happens in startups, scale-ups. It happens in the tech sector. So the real question is not how can we develop technologies ourselves per se, but it is how do we connect to the innovation that is already happening in our countries from a defense and security perspective. And I don't worry about it, but it is something that we need to speed up to try and get more to grips on the security aspects of new technologies as they are being developed now.
So you worry about basically the Internet of Things and there being a solution out there to address some of the security gaps, but that solution's in the private sector, and you don't think it's going to migrate quickly enough to head off the next hack of a government ministry through a supply chain, something that happened to the United States?
Well, I don't think if we'll ever be able to fully defend ourselves against these supply chain hacks as we see them. I think we should put emphasis on imposing more costs on those perpetrators that are doing it now and seem to think that they can act with impunity. And on the other hand, make sure that we have a larger resilience in our networks, in our cyber architecture, in order to be able to quickly recover from these attacks, because we see what kind of disruption they can cause. You mentioned SolarWinds, but I think the Colonial pipeline hack is another example of the great effects it can have. So I'm not too worried that the private sector is leading in innovation and technology. It's more how can we have a better synergy between the security and defense and governmental organizations at large and the tech sector on the other hand.
And perhaps in technology there are some answers to that. Let's go to Professor Shea. You must have been paying a close attention to SolarWinds and the Colonial hack.
Well, yes, absolutely. And I think it goes to show that despite all of the billions that we've invested in cybersecurity in industry, in organizations, in government, over the last decade or so, since we woke up to the vulnerability of information technology, we still have a long way to go, particularly when it comes, of course, to guaranteeing software, to detecting attacks early. We're still discovering these things are too late in the day, of course, and finding an effective playbook of response options. The United States is now looking at this further, which could deter these kind of activities. But coming back to your, Kimberly, to your sort of key question at the outset, I think that the real challenge is that for most of my NATO career, conflict was in three classical domains: land, sea, and air. But now we have adversaries who can equal us often in land, sea, and air platforms and are developing their own technologies, no longer simply copying what we've already done, although they want to do that as well. But we've got these three new domains that have come along. Cyber, you've referred to that. We've got space, where NATO declared space as an operational domain back in 2019. And we've got the whole sort of perception of reality, virtualization, information space as well. So in a way, I think the real challenge is knowing at any one time, if we've got a sort of a spare $1 million, where are we going to get the most defense from our investment? Is it in going for conventional platforms? Is it going now for more investment in cybersecurity? Is it the resilience of our space-based systems? It's how do we make the right investments so that we keep that qualitative edge, which David rightly mentioned a moment ago, and how do we do what our adversaries are trying to do as well, which is join up those domains so that we can easily sort of process data from one to another at real-time speed, because it's not so much the person who is sort of individually superior in each domain, it's the person who manages to sort of join them up that I think is going to have a big advantage in future conflict. I think a second big issue is that NATO is now much more active. You see this week in Romania with Steadfast Defender, with momentum of exercises, being ready. That's key for deterrence. But of course, as you put more money into existing operations, it's going to put limitations on what you have for innovation. For example, in the EU, the average is only 8% spending on innovation at the moment, which is far too low to really stay in the game. As you know, the classic art of warfare is that you have an army which is good for today's contingencies, while making sure that that army stays state-of-the-art in 10 or 20 years' time. History is replete with examples of countries like Italy and in the days of Mussolini that had a big advantage in the 20s, but by the time of the Second World War, their equipment was largely obsolete. They didn't invest enough in the future. So I think for NATO, it's getting that balance of present readiness versus, keeping those forces state-of-the-art in 10 or 20 years' time. It's that balance, I think, which is really going to be critical. Thank you.
So it sounds like, you're all mentioning this aspect of how to get all of these different aspects of national security and international security to work in concert. And I remember hearing frequently from U.S. military commanders and U.S. intelligence operators that they needed the wars of Iraq and Afghanistan to force them to break down a lot of the stovepipes and put people and classified systems all in the same room, these joint operating centers that were never allowed before. And all of a sudden, they were able to see each other's worlds. They were able to get questions quickly. It broke down, what we call in Washington the rice bowl mentality of, oh, I need this money for my program. It built a lot of respect. It built the personal relationships that are the ones that you call on. The problem was, once the forcing functions of the Iraq and Afghan wars diminished, I talked to some of those same commanders like Admiral Bill McRaven back in the United States when he was still active duty. He lamented, we're losing those relationships. And if someone like that didn't know how to maintain them and keep those connections, how are you going to do it now in this environment, especially in a post-pandemic environment when we're still doing a lot of meetings like this? But I'm stealing thunder from Professor Limnell. It is your turn.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation. And greetings from sunny Finland, which is actually one of the most digitized countries in the whole world. Well, I have to say, as David said, I am sleeping my nights pretty well as well. But when I'm following the current development of technologies, and especially its security implications, I have to say that my biggest worry is about the threats and risks that I don't know. When I'm thinking about the resources, what especially some countries, some big global technological companies are putting to develop these technologies nowadays in a wide perspective, I would say that from the, for example, cyber perspective, I am most worried about what is happening already, for example, in our networks that I am not aware of, what we don't know actually what is happening and how we are able to predict that. And I think one of the key points when we are thinking about this accelerating speed of digitalization and development of technology is, of course, cooperation. We in Finland, we have a very, very long tradition of this concept of comprehensive security, where more or less the whole public sector, private sector, academia, different organizations, associations, as well as citizens are working together in order to create security. And that's more or less the only way how we can manage security in our reality here in Finland. But I think in this reality, this comprehensive security is not anymore enough. I mean, security model 2.0, where international cooperation with like-minded nations, as well as like-minded technological companies, is not a good thing, it's a necessity. And that, in a way, we have to choose our sides as well. For example, from the value point of view, that with whom we would like to predict these technologies and prevent the threats and risks.
So you mentioned how necessary it is that the local population really understands the threat and acts. How do you see that kind of cooperation representing itself? Is it in terms of, does Finland have the highest number of people who always update their apps, for instance? I mean, how do you know that they're working with you?
Well, that's a good point. Thank you very much for raising that up. Actually, we just 2 weeks ago, or actually less than 2 weeks ago, our government published the latest internal security paper, which is actually the second one. And I think one of the key points to answer your question is not thinking about only from this like a skills point of view or like a technical point of view, but how you feel. What is your security feeling? And I would say that we are in a good position in Finland, even if I say it as a Finn, where in that paper, it was based on large survey, 96% of Finns felt that they feel secure when they are in Finland. And I think this security feeling in this digital reality and more or less in this comprehensive security reality, that's a very strong point to measure that how secure you are.
Well, I would like to dig into one of the key challenges that you've all mentioned, disinformation, and start with our Romanian hosts. Now, Romania is on the front lines as not just a NATO member, but also a close U.S. partner and ally with the U.S. confrontation with Russia. You have hosted more than 90 U.S. soldiers recently, U.S. troops who were running a drone base. I just got an email this morning from the U.S. Europe Command that they're going to be flying strategic bombers over all NATO nations, including Romania. You're on the receiving end of a lot of Russian disinformation. And you launched a program a couple years ago called Get to Know NATO, or Know NATO?
We are NATO.
We are NATO. To try to fight the disinformation that's, as I understand it, aimed at making Romanians turn against NATO. So what are some of the successes from that?
Thank you very much, Kimberly. So I would like to follow up also some insights that our distinguished panelists share with us. So first, I would like to say that, again, NATO 2030, 30 allies looking at that horizon. EU member states are also looking ahead in the strategic compass. And Romania, which is now a very responsible, robust and mature ally and member states, is doing a lot. The key word today is resilience. And thank you for mentioning again, and also in this format, the offer to host the Euro-Atlantic Center for Resilience. Today is the day for inauguration. So I think resilience is the key concept, a comprehensive one, including, if you like, many facets of the challenges that we are confronting today. I have 5 points on my agenda that I would like very much to share with you, in which I believe we should handle emerging and disruptive technologies, including disinformation, fake news, and this kind of challenges. The first one is understanding the phenomenon from the perspective of global power competition. And now I would like to say that Russia and China elevates significant security risk and challenges to NATO, making emerging and disruptive technologies a primary focus of their strategies. Russia's new actions, new systems employed or deployed, including in cyber environment, are incorporating emerging and disruptive technologies as new enablers. Moreover, China is using 5G and subsequent technologies to achieve influence and control over strategic security infrastructure. So it's important to take urgent steps to stay ahead in the technology race ahead these two actors. So it's very, very important.
In that China is providing 5G at a lower cost, at very attractive rates. Is that one of the ways that they're trying to corner the market and therefore influence more people?
They are taking very, very important measures from economic benefits. So we have to, to balance economy with security, which is very, very important. Second is adapting our strategies and institutions. So first is to understand, and second is to adapt, which is very, very important. And and the distinguished speakers know very, very well the actions that the Alliance took very recently. I will mention only the last one in February on the occasion of the NATO Defense Ministerial. The Ministers of Defense agreed a coherent strategy on emerging and disruptive technology implementation. And by the way, Romania supports strongly NATO's innovation initiative, because we are talking now about a new initiative in NATO, which is very important with like-minded allies to define the political parameters of these new initiatives right now. Moreover, third, which I think it's one of the most important actions that we can take in order to confront these new challenges, education. This is of paramount importance, and I think it's important to develop educational programs to include in our scenarios, in the operational scenarios.
So educational programs like news literacy or like the We Are NATO program?
We are talking about a whole range of instruments, be it the curricula of the defense institutions, exercises, training, enhanced allied cooperation, including public-private formats. So there are a lot of opportunities, and we have to to take advantage of these particular opportunities. And you said that your question in the beginning was related to the most pressing challenge, and I think indeed artificial intelligence is the most pressing right now, and I think again we should give more priority in the efforts, in the collective efforts or EU.
To develop AI capabilities or to guard against AI-driven threats like deepfakes?
It's about a common framework to deal with artificial intelligence that could comprise policy, legal, ethical capabilities, interoperability issues.
So just like we don't have a global strategy on how to deal with ransomware attacks, we need to come up with a global strategy and response, as the Assistant Secretary was saying, to make the bad actors pay for their actions, and we don't have that yet in AI.
Not yet, because we should base our common framework, our policies, on democratic values and rule of law, and we are progressing. We are progressing towards these objectives to, to develop or to frame all our actions, efforts in a common framework. The fourth is building long-standing and strong public-private partnerships. This is a very, very important issue. And
is there one here? A lot of people tuning into this may not have familiarity with Romania. Is there one that you could point to as an example of where it's working, a public-private partnership?
The government is putting a lot of effort in this. You know that Romania is hosting also a EU Center for Cyber. We are now going to host the Euro-Atlantic Center for Resilience. So the government is paying a lot of attention, and as I said, we are trying to make, if you like, a trademark for Romania and to help others in understanding these new challenges and to bring a real contribution to this.
I see. So those are platforms that
will help
that will help the two sides meet together.
Yes.
Just like our energy panel this morning had both academics, government, and members of industry.
Right.
Okay.
And Mircea Joana, Deputy Secretary General, very, very recently said that more than 80% of the innovation with security implication is produced by the private sector. So it's crystal clear that we have to focus more on this sector. And fifth, and I will stop, is related to necessary resources. Because this is the solid basis for each and every effort we are undergoing. And I could say at this point that Romania is also very much focused on this, since we are in the 5th year of allotting 2% for defense.
So you mean everyone has to pay up just as much as Romania is investing in fighting against these threats. So I'm going to go back to the Assistant Secretary and ask, this sounds like what you would like every member state to be doing. How's it going?
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm very grateful to Romania and their constructive attitude towards these topics. And to be honest, I'm quite optimistic. The minister mentioned the coherent implementation strategy on EDTs that we adopted in NATO in February, which basically sets out a system of dealing with new technologies. So on the one hand, generically, we need to get closer to the innovation ecosystems that we have in our countries from a security perspective. We need to discuss amongst ourselves what are the ethical rules of responsible use that we want to impose on these technologies. We need to understand what our adversaries and potential adversaries are doing with these technologies. So there's a whole range of activities that have been set in motion now, and that will hopefully enable us to master the field of EDTs in a much better way. And of course, this is something that we'll have to take in a step-by-step approach. And it was already mentioned, but I think AI in combination with data are the two most imminent technologies that we need to get a handle around. AI is being widely used, mostly unregulated in a large part of the private sector at this moment. It is a groundbreaking technology that can really shape and change our lives and the battlefield. And we need to step up our game in order to become a credible player in this field from a security and defense perspective. And there, NATO is the platform to do it. This is where 30 allies with 9 out of 10 top universities in the world, when it comes down to AI, come together and can discuss the norms, the values, the threats it poses, the way they want to tackle it, and what they want their AI to adhere to when it comes down to standards. So we have a great opportunity.
So that sounds great, but it's my turn to play the red teamer here. I have been to some amazing conferences and discussions over the past decade that have discussed these issues, and yet I haven't seen anyone move towards setting standards. NATO is a cohesive alliance that could, if NATO set the standard, that could end up setting the world standard. You could beat the UN to it, you could beat a number of different other alliances. So when is it going to happen? For instance, when are you going to decide, at least on AI, what is a dangerous activity by the private sector that could interfere with security operations, or what counts as an attack that you have a right to respond to as a NATO member state?
So on the standard part, I think that NATO is indeed a platform of 30 advanced nations that if they decide what is responsible use of AI and what isn't, can really make a difference on the world stage. We're not a legislative body like the EU is, or the UN can be if we come to agreement, but we can certainly play our part in the discussion in the run-up, and we can make sure that all allies have cohesion. So you should always under-promise and over-deliver, so I'm not going to name a date to you, but the AI strategy that NATO is working on now will be the first document where we actually specify what are the principles of responsible use that all 30 allies adhere to, that we find important in the use of AI. And these are not always groundbreaking principles, and there's 1 or 2 allies that already have these kind of principles in place. The groundbreaking thing is that all 30 allies will say, this is what AI is supposed to adhere to. If your AI cannot be proven, tested, certified by us to adhere to these principles, then it will not be used. And hopefully that will have a driving force for the industry as well, as to what we expect them to develop and to incorporate into their AI developments. So in that case, we are trying to play a steering role into the further development of AI in a responsible manner. And well, a very important part of that is also how do we present ourselves as a trusted user as NATO to our publics. I think it's crucial that our publics understand that NATO using these new technologies is not a threat. It's actually a way of encapsulating our democratic values into these technologies and safeguarding the misuse against them.
And I have to say, if you are in the United States, you get bombarded by ads from Facebook on all media asking for updated internet regulation, basically so that they don't have to decide, well, whatever policy they've decided, they constantly get criticized, so they keep daring the US government and the international community to come up with standards. So it'll be really interesting when this document comes out. I'd like to turn to Professor Limnell, since this is, cybersecurity is your key area. What do you think such an AI document would do to the discussion, to making the cyber world safer?
Well, that's a huge question, I have to say. And, I agree with David that when I'm thinking about the technologies that will, during this decade, have the biggest influence in our warfare, our capabilities, as well as national security, those are the AI and data, and how we are able to connect them and use them for good and bad purposes as well. Well, I have to say that one of the key points here is transparency. And as long as we don't have that kind of transparency, what, for example, the European Union is looking for with the AI issues at the moment, we are having challenges with this area in the global politics for sure. And then on the other hand, I think that data ownership here becomes more and more important question, also from the military point of view. And especially from the cybersecurity point of view, I think we are moving to the world where probably the biggest challenge is not anymore that, for example, someone breaches into your system and steals your data or deletes, destroys your data, but manipulates it. So you are not able to trust anymore the content of the data. So you lose at least some part of the integrity of the data. And I think that will be a very big issue, not only for the militaries, but for the companies and societies as well.
Yeah, how do you trust the data? That brings us back to the disinformation question. Professor Shea, wanted to go to you to see if you had thoughts on disinformation or follow-on thoughts on what would you be able to do with an AI strategy, a published AI strategy from NATO?
Yeah, first of all, last time I came in, I totally forgot, very impolitely, and excuse me, to thank once again the organizers, the GMF and Aspen of the Atlantic Black Sea Security Forum for inviting me. It's my second time, so thank you very much. I'm delighted to be back. My sense is that a lot has been said about this already. NATO is a great place, for number one, for setting standards among allies, but NATO also has 40-odd partner countries in Asia Pacific, in the Middle East, as well in Eastern Europe. And obviously, if you're going to push these sort of global standards, you need to have Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, these sort of countries on board. And one of the ways I think that NATO can really revitalize its partnerships now is by getting them also to sign up, for example, to cyber confidence building measures, the rules of the road in terms of anti-satellite weapons and weapons that can disrupt communications in space. We're now relying much more on space now for things like weather mapping, for our communications, for early warning, for dealing with climate change. So we've really got to keep military systems as far as we can out of space. China and Russia are going in the other direction at the moment, and so we need these our partners on board as well. AI, where the EU, as was just being said a moment ago, has now, the European Parliament has come up with a code of conduct. We could sort of of take that and put it into the NATO more sort of global network and see how we can push these things forward. NATO isn't necessarily the organization that sort of goes to the UN and negotiates these type of things, but it's certainly the place where a kind of international sort of democratic standard can be devised. Now, that doesn't mean to say that China and Russia are necessarily going to sign on to that. And one of the worries that I have is that they would develop different AI standards, particularly when it comes to automatic autonomous weapons systems, which would program themselves and fire themselves out of the human loop. So we don't want a situation, if you like, where we do lawfare and they do warfare. But nonetheless, if you can get through the alliance a large grouping of the global democracies to sort of get behind a standard, it does put Russia and China on the back foot. I mean, look at climate change, where the way in which the democracies have come together to set more ambitious standards for dealing with global warming and reducing carbon emissions has persuaded, you know, Russia and China that they have no option, if they want to be good citizens, but to go along and offer, as they did at the World Earth Day Summit recently, binding targets of their own. So we need to use NATO not just as a technology institution, but as this kind of sort of global standard setting platform. Can I just mention one other thing though? I know that, Kim, today you're very much into the debate on new technologies, and rightly so, but don't forget, we've got to deal with old technologies as well. Nuclear weapons are still around, conventional weapons are still around. You know, we've got Russia massing troops on the border with Ukraine, with no transparency, with no observers. A lot of the regimes that we used to have to deal with the old weapon systems, which are still more destructive than the new technologies so far, these arms control systems have fallen by the wayside. And therefore, I think NATO has to get back into a double game, dealing, of course, with the standards in the new areas, but not forgetting, you know, to go back to the traditional business of what do we do about nuclear proliferation, chemical weapons, which are now being used more frequently in Syria by the Russians in Salisbury, the fact we don't have any conventional arms control regime in Europe any longer. So the old business cannot simply be dismissed because we all want to chase the sexy new business.
I just want to take a moment to ask our virtual audience, if you have any questions, please drop them into the chat. And also our audience in the room, if anyone has any questions here, raise your hand and we will get a microphone to you. We have one over here. Okay. So as we get the microphone to you, I will just ask one more question to you.
Kimberly,
yes.
I just want to follow what Jamie just said. Yes, conventional threats, challenges, risks are still here. And the danger is that all these challenges, be it conventional, be it the new ones, are overlapping. And here is the nexus that we have to focus on, because these are going to progress, and that's why I have started answering your first question by referring to COVID-19, because it was something which was not predicted. It was something very new with implications that target, you know, life of people, social, economic, and with a lot of important implications. So we have to have in our minds, when we are addressing ambitiously emerging and disruptive technologies, also the conventional ones, and we have to look ahead to the unpredictable ones.
So before we go to our audience question, one quick thing. What do you think, what is one technological innovation from COVID-19 that's going to stay with us?
Of course, I think everybody of us learned first how to work virtually. So I think this is the most important thing. I mean, just look back at the beginning of 2020, we didn't use, let's be frank, we didn't know how to use some platforms. And we are now specialized, you know, and I think everybody grew its own expertise, and we learned how to interact and to go ahead. This is the most important thing, I guess.
I think it's also going to be the apps that we all learned to download to get information from the government on COVID.
Yes.
Could you introduce yourself and ask us your question?
Hello, everyone. My name is Stefano Laro. I'm coming from NATO's Joint Analysis and Lessons Learned Center. And thank you very much for all the insights provided, very enlightening on this very hot topic, which is emerging technologies, emerging and disruptive technologies. And we have heard many times, not necessarily buzzwords like artificial intelligence was a topic here, but also quantum computing, autonomy systems, and all the ethical implications. Now, we have heard also that they are developing in a very rapid pace. Professor Shi mentioned before that NATO should adapt and operate, should transform itself to keep pace with these transformations. So now, how NATO as an organization can transform so fast to make sure that is employing properly these new technologies, but also maintain his robustness and power of intervention without changing too much and going on a transformation which might not be for sure guaranteed the success there. Potential solution I have heard can be the digital literacy of the members, but any other insights on this topic are welcome.
Thank you. Who would like to tackle that first?
Yes, I will, if I may, since I'm the one that's supposed to be steering this effort into the right direction yes. From this position. It is not an either-or question. And I think that also goes into what the Minister said and what Jamie said. I mean, it's not that we disband and whatever we do now, and we venture into new technologies only. That is not the aim of the game. The aim of the game is how do we keep up with the innovation that's going on outside, and how do we incorporate that into our daily business. And I think that doesn't require the whole organization to change. It does require education across the board. We do need to get more digitally literate at all levels. It does require clear guidance, policy, standards for the operators to know where to head with these technologies. It does require interaction between those who are actually developing these technologies and our operators in the military that have possible places where this technology could be of use. But that doesn't have to be across the whole organization. And there, forgive me for being Dutch, but I always take the company of Philips as an example, which was a very large multinational, which was able to produce the most groundbreaking technology throughout decennia, whether it be the CD and others. So they had a mechanism where within their company, which was large and therefore by default bureaucratic to a certain stage, but they had a smaller capacity for innovation that had more freedom, less robust procedures in place, less strict goals and outcomes, where actually innovation was being stimulated and where the cutting edge was being developed. I think we're looking for something like that, which doesn't replace anything that NATO does in the defense and deterrence realm, but it does allow us to tap into these innovation systems that are in all our countries. And that doesn't require billions and billions, to be honest.
See, if I may, Kimberly, I will add to what Assistant Secretary General just said, that NATO recognized the emerging and disruptive technologies and took concrete steps. And I will also recall the fact that in December 2019, NATO summit in London, our leaders endorsed a comprehensive roadmap for emerging and disruptive technologies. And as I said earlier, the most important thing is to set a solid foundation to chart our future actions. And this foundation should start from understanding these new technologies and their potential application to defense and security issues. And the roadmap highlights 7 important areas. We have talked about this during our conversation earlier, and I will say it again: big data, artificial intelligence, quantum, autonomy, hypersonic, and biotechnologies. So yes, NATO is focused on this. The work is progressing, and as the other speaker said, NATO is very, very much involved.
So I have a concrete question for all of you. Well, it's a hypothetical, but if you were an ordinary person watching this panel, you might not grasp a lot of the strategic concepts. They might go over your head. But I'm going to ask what each of you would do if there was a video released purporting to be a hot mic moment of Jan Stoltenberg ordering the assassination of Vladimir Putin. It hits the web. It looks like it's a grainy cell phone video of him maybe shot from a table, and he's sitting, you know, you can see the tablecloth. You can sort of see Stoltenberg. It's definitely his voice. It spreads everywhere. How would you knock that down? If you know, when there was a chemical attack in Syria, there's one UK lab that everyone trusts to do the test. Where would you send that snippet of video so that you could communicate to the maximum number of people as quickly as possible across the world that that is a deep fake? Assistant Secretary, let's throw that hot potato to you first.
Yeah, thanks. I'm used to that. My apologies that I will have to leave in 2 minutes. So thank you for handing me the floor and for the very interesting discussion. I think key is credibility and trust when it comes down to communication. So do people trust NATO as an organization? Do they trust the Secretary General when he comes out into the public and says, well, this is a deepfake video? Because if you haven't got that basic level of trust amongst your own populations, then whatever laboratory you will get will probably be too late to counter the first negative effects of such a deepfake video.
But how about Russians? You want Russians to believe it too, right?
Well, everybody speaks to their own audience, I would say. And I think that one of the things that we've seen in the intensified disinformation campaign, namely coming out of Russia, that I think the resilience of our Western population against the Russian disinformation has increased. So we should also trust our audiences to be able to distinguish between the well-intentions and the bad intentions. But now we're getting into communication psychology, and Jamie is much better at that than I am.
Jamie, do you think anyone could analyze it and be trusted? You know, would Google or Apple or some big tech organization be able to quickly knock it down?
Yes, I believe they could. First of all, I think David gave the answer that I would have wanted to give myself in any case. But first of all, deepfakes are now familiar. You know, we've had Nancy Pelosi looking drunk in the US Congress, clearly a deepfake, rapidly discredited. We've had deepfakes of Obama, again, rapidly discredited. So the public are aware that technology now allows you to do these things. My own view is that they're likely to be much more effective when you have sort of two countries who are in a dispute. This happened recently between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, where a deep fake intervened, and where, if you like, sort of over-the-top statements were already being made. So the deep fake could have a little bit of credibility if it comes from somebody who would say outrageous things anyway. But when it comes to somebody like Jens Stoltenberg, who was always, as David said, totally on a reasonable sort of platform, then I think it's going to be a deep ask for people to actually believe that, number one. Number two, as long as the traditional media do not pick it up and they are alert also that not allowing themselves to be manipulated, it's unlikely to resonate, even if it does on social media. Number three, you can ask the social media companies to trace it, because everything is in the origin. Who sent it? And if this obviously comes from a source, you know, deep inside Russia or China, then it's clear right from the get-go that this is a kind of manipulation. So even before you can do the technical analysis to prove that it's a fabrication, by sourcing it back to a very suspect origin, you can discredit it. But yeah, you're absolutely right, Kim. This is a new reality of the technological age that we have to be geared for. But the fact that it's been tried already with limited results, like David, makes me optimistic that NATO can deal with this. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Limnall, where would be the ultimate arbiter for you?
Well, I think the gentleman gave excellent answers already. And when I'm thinking about the security from the wider perspective, I have to say that the role of the communications in security is going to increase much more than it is the role at the moment. But then on the other hand, coming from non-NATO country, maybe I could ask a little bit different question here, because now we keep repeating quite a lot, also in militaries, that okay, technology will change everything and we are going to digitize everything. And I think it was very good point from Jamie Shee saying that, okay, we should not forget these old threats as well, because they are still very relevant. And I can say you that that is very relevant coming from Finland. Maybe we should ask a little bit differently also that, okay, what should not be digitized? What kind of data or information should not be digitized? Where we should not use technology from the security point of view. And I think one of the points where we have ended up, at least at the moment in Finland, is that even if we have the capabilities to digitize the elections, we are not doing that because of the security reasons. We are still trusting the good old paper and pen, and I think that's the right way to do it, at least at the moment.
Good old paper and pen.
So,
and yes, I was going to say, and how do you, who do Romanians trust? I mean, how would you get this across to them?
So for a Romanian, the answer is quite natural. I won't believe at all in this, because in Romania, the trust in NATO is very high. In the annual report issued by the Secretary General for the last year, Romanians were listed with more than 70% trust in the alliance. So, and I think it's also a matter of education. That's why I have listed in my top 5 education as a very important instrument to confront these new challenges like fake news and so on, because, you know, and indeed it's a matter of trust, confidence, education.
And do you have, or are you considering introducing media literacy, for instance, at a very young age, so that people understand the difference in Romania between a reporter who is careful with their sources versus someone who puts a lot of opinion in their story versus someone who is messaging?
Yes, this is among our plans. And we at the Ministry of Defense, we developed by the colleagues in the Public Affairs Directorate platforms to counteract the fake news. So it was an important endeavor developed quite recently in face of the COVID-19 fake news. I mean, it was very, very beneficial. And again, we are very much trusting the alliance, and we are very much confident.
How young do you start that training?
Elementary school. I mean, my boy is in the school, and they are accustomed with this kind of education. However, they are very much used with the computers and comparing with my generation. So there are good prospects.
So that is a great way to end it, because the fact of the matter is, for some of us in an older generation who are still learning how to operate all of these, my nieces and nephews can already, they can program, they can speak programmer, some things that I never even learned.
Yes.
So perhaps they will know the place that they trust to go on the web to knock things down.
Let's hope so.
And perhaps they will also be the generation that develops the programs that can tell the difference between real and fake.
It will be brilliant.
Yes. On that note, I would like to thank the Aspen Romania organization and also GMF and your government for sponsoring, for hosting us, and thank all of our panelists as well. And now we will clear the way for the next speaker.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It is my pleasure to introduce to you the next speaker, the person who is going to introduce the panel that's going to follow after that. Somebody who has a lot of experience, as we are just explained, in military endeavors within NATO and in security in general. It is my honor and pleasure to invite Sir Stuart Peach, Chairman of Military Committee of NATO, to join me to the podium. Sir Stuart Peach, please come. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. And as you've heard, I am the Chairman of the Military Committee and also the Military Advisor to the Secretary General of NATO, and I'm also the military member of the North Atlantic Council. Let me say at the beginning that the Black Sea region is of great importance to the Alliance. Therefore, I was particularly keen during my visit to Romania to join this panel today. And Alliance unity and our unity of purpose has helped bring an end to both the Cold War and conflict ever since. And it's also worth reminding this audience that we guarantee the security of over 1 billion people through shared values. And of course, those shared values are under threat. And we see the security landscape shifting. We see a more assertive Russia. We see terrorism. We see cyber threats. We see nuclear proliferation. We see climate change, which has security implications. And of course, I'm wearing my mask today diligently as we respond to the pandemic. So our shared security has to adapt to new challenges. Since 2014, we have adapted. We've strengthened our military posture in this region, particularly in the Black Sea. And we have a number of other changes since the illegal annexation of Crimea. And so, as we modernize and adapt, we need to embrace new techniques. We need to challenge hybrid warfare. We need to enhance our cyber defenses, develop our own technologies to develop our own technological edge, whilst also ensuring we remain an alliance capable of deploying hard power, and I'll come back to that. And we continue to invest in new capabilities. I think importantly for this region, we also continue to adapt both our intelligence capability in the alliance and also our exercise posture, which is why I'm here today, Exercise Steadfast Defender 21. So on land, at sea, in the air, in cyberspace and space, NATO is present, which safeguards both freedom and security for our members and for our partners. Now, today, we are getting ready for a NATO summit in 2 weeks' time, 2 weeks today. And Allied heads of state and government at the end of 2019 asked Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg to strengthen NATO's political dimension. That process is called NATO 2030. It's not about reinvention, it's about making us stronger militarily, stronger politically, and more global in our approach. And resilience in your region and elsewhere is part of that. It's about looking to the future to learn, improve, and adapt. Solid foundations to build on, and we have those throughout our history of 72 years. So in 2 weeks' time, the Secretary General will make his proposals to Allied heads of state and government. But I would also remind this audience that we've had adapted throughout our history. And on my 3-year tenure as the Chairman of the Military Committee, we have approved for the first time since 1967 a NATO military strategy, created to give us a framework, a handrail for the future. And in that process, we have moved from capability-based assessment to threat-based assessment. This strategy has helped us to develop 2 further concepts. The deterrence and defense of the Euro-Atlantic region, which brings together all the military thinking we need from allies under the hand of our operational commander, SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, to understand the consequences of a changed security environment. That has an element of resilience built into it. In addition, we have developed and approved a NATO warfighting capstone concept which looks 20 years out. And that will help us to adapt the military instrument of power. Now, the detail of these documents, quiz me as you like, remains classified. The purpose in me outlining them here today is to say this is what keeps us strong and remain fit for the future. In addition, we need to demonstrate to the people we keep safe and secure presence, the right place at the right time, 360 degrees. Romania makes a very important contribution to that security. You play a key part in your region. You make a substantial contribution both to our partnership to Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova. You've increased defense spending to over 2%. You host NATO units. I have visited today the Multinational Division Southeast, not for the first time, I hasten to add, but I was very impressed. And for the first time today, I visited the Multinational Corps Southeast. So Romania is also ambitious. You also host the Aegis Ashore at Deveselu, which is a vital element of capability. So I would argue, as the chairman of the Military Committee and the senior advisor to the Secretary General, Romania is a committed, important ally. And you continue to support us with activity, whether it's our mission in Afghanistan, which is about to enter a new chapter, our mission in Iraq, our missions in the Balkans. In addition, you conduct patrols and exercises in many places. And so, freedom of navigation at sea and in the air remain vital principles which require freedom of movement, which requires resilience. And there is so much disinformation, misinformation, that we also need to bear in mind that one of the roles, whether it's traditional or not, for senior people in the Alliance and in the Chiefs of Defence community friendship group is to make sure that we have a strategic communications message and we reassure the public we're trying to protect, to counter disinformation. And we see this more than ever. We see this actually every day. And we do that by setting minimum resilience standards. Sounds boring on one level, but it shows again NATO's convening authority to go beyond the routine use of military power. Last year, NATO defence ministers discussed a very important comprehensive report on the state of our own infrastructure, including ports, airports, railways, fuel and food supplies, and medical equipment. This was before the pandemic, and telecommunications, including 5G. You may not be so aware that since the pandemic began, NATO has been extremely busy. Over 500,000 NATO forces have been mobilized by all allies to help support the response to the pandemic. We've built over 100 field hospitals under the hand of NATO. We've conducted over 1,000 humanitarian relief flights, moving medical equipment and medical personnel from ally to ally. And I wish to pay tribute today, as part of our resilience discussion, to the military medical professionals of all allies in general, and today in particular to Romania. There are more Romanian people alive than there would have been without them. It's a simple message. And the way in which the military medical personnel in NATO responded and continue to respond is really impressive. We've kept our readiness as where we need it. Our ships are still at sea. Operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, and the Balkans continue. In addition, we've used our command structure, which marks us out from any other international organization, 24 hours a day. We have a Euro-Atlantic Disaster Crisis Response Center, which has been very active in handling hundreds of requests for support, from personal protective equipment through to much bigger support, such as ventilators and other medical equipment. NATO's Support and Procurement Agency. I have almost 50 years military service. It's the best support and procurement agency I've ever seen. It's responsive. In one case that I was deeply involved in, they built a field hospital in less than 24 hours at a time of need. So we have done a lot. We are not first responders. We never say we're first responders, but we are determined to uphold the values we protect. And this period here in Romania, we now see exercise Steadfast Defender, which is the largest exercise of this year, which demonstrates our ability to reinforce across the Atlantic, and it also demonstrates how we are adapting our command structure. So it begins the other side of the Atlantic. And I was on the British aircraft carrier, the brand new British aircraft carrier, HMS Queen Elizabeth, with the Secretary General 3 days ago in the Atlantic, demonstrating reinforcement. Here we are today in Bucharest, demonstrating the next phase of the exercise here as we welcome the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force and exercise with our Romanian hosts that task force in the next few days. We're also testing our new logistics centre in Ulm in Germany, the Joint Support Enabling Command, and of course, as I said earlier, the Joint Forces Command in Norfolk. So this is NATO in action, this is resilience in action, along with our response to the pandemic, and therefore to help keep people safe, we need to keep learning and adapting from exercises, learning and adapting from the pandemic. We have an operation ready if there's a further pandemic. We also need to work with companies and countries on technology to take shortcuts and identify quick wins. I've also launched an initiative with the Chiefs of Defence of NATO on climate change, which has security implications. I sometimes am surprised that people are not aware that we have over 40 partnership countries. They range in activity from daily to less frequent, and we also work, of course, with the United Nations, the African Union, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the European Union. So we look out, we don't look in. And we need to continue to protect our values and safeguard our unity. That means we need to develop a culture of resilience at every level, almost from the individual to the head of government. We need to be able to withstand a crisis, recover from crises when they surprise us, and learn and adapt. I can tell you, because the next panel member is the head of it, that we are a learning organization and we do continue to adapt. So in 2 weeks' time, I look forward to the decisions that heads of state and government will give us, which will be aimed to preserve not just our political role and our military role, but also to make us stronger. And if I have a message, it is our unity and strength is derived from our promise to defend each other, because we are stronger together. Thank you, and I'm happy now to take questions either from the room or from online.
Sir, you have mentioned Russia in your keynote speech, and I want to ask you, what is your evaluation regarding Russia's aggressive military posture here on the Black Sea area? And what is NATO preparing in order to develop a deterrence and defense area here on the eastern flank? Thank you.
Well, we have, at one of our meetings last year, we agreed to strengthen our presence in the Black Sea, which we've done. So some of this answer to your question is about NATO presence. Some of this is about presence that was planned anyway, now flying the NATO flag. Some of this is about, as I've said with Steadfast Defender, coordinating our exercises to achieve a real-world effect. Much of it is also about working with our partners around the Black Sea region. We have 2 enhanced opportunity partners in the region, Ukraine and Georgia, and we work extremely closely with them to develop capabilities and pursue necessary reform. And so we have a range of measures, a range of tools which we're activating. In addition, we continue to support them through the pandemic. I've been in both Ukraine and Georgia recently, and I can testify to all of that. Romania has a very important role to play in this region, and as a strong and important ally, we look forward to ideas from Romania how we may go even further. And so I think we've met the tasking from our heads of state and government and from the defense ministers. But regionally, we do need to take note of the posture, whether it's aggression by physical means or by hybrid and other means. And there I think we do have work to do, to understand the information environment, to understand disinformation and misinformation when it happens, and be prepared to respond quickly and accurately. And I can't emphasize that last point enough. We abide on our exercises by the Vienna document. We support the international processes. We follow international law. We have rules of engagement. And our forces at sea and in the air follow international norms extremely closely. So we follow the rules, and Russia sometimes does not. And so we need to be ready to understand what is happening and the facts, and then respond to them with both activities and exercises.
Thank you. Kim Dozier with Time. Have you found any tactic that is effective in keeping Russia from pumping out disinformation? And do you think that Russian aggression will persist as long as Putin is in power?
Well, first comment would be, we see patterns of Russian behavior which transcend technology. And I made this comment in a media interview on the ship, on the HMS Queen Elizabeth the other day. And so I think in national policy terms, the sort of approach is not new. The platforms and the technology enable the approach. So in order to develop the tactic, I'm afraid I don't see a silver bullet. I don't see a perfect, immediate breakthrough in technology. What I do see is the importance of understanding the media environment, the information environment. Therefore, I'd highlight two things. The first is we have a really quite excellent strategic communications center of excellence in Riga, in Latvia. And they are a bunch of 70 or 80 people who literally understand that media and other information environment very well. And we need to give that type of activity more prominence in developing our own strategic communications. The second is the Cyber Center of Excellence in Estonia, which is truly outstanding. And they are completing their series of exercises for 2021, or early part of 21, today. And I've been involved in that exercise, and again, it's very impressive. And we learn and adapt each time we do an exercise. So my answer to your question, and it is a good question, is it isn't one tactic. It's an understanding which we need to continue to develop into a more high volume understanding. We need to then integrate that understanding into our missions, which we're doing. So now our missions include and embrace cyber as routine. It's not special now, it's routine. So we need to protect our people from disinformation. We need to preserve and protect our networks. And the way to think about it, perhaps, in terms of the tactic question, is a good way of explaining it from my perspective is, throughout the pandemic, we're the only international organization that has completely sustained a secure network 24 hours a day, which is secure from heads of state and government down to the lowest private soldier. And we can do that at high volume, and so we can remain a secure environment, whether we're discussing sensitive medical information or intelligence information. And so the ability to command and control in a secure way from the heads of state downwards, I think marks us out. So again, it's not a single tactic, it's almost an approach which says, yes, the aggression is here to stay, yes, we live in a contested information environment, therefore we have a duty to understand it better. Everybody wants the panel discussion.
That second question on Vladimir Putin, is there a way to convince him that NATO is not a threat?
Well, we are a defensive alliance, and that's true. And we have always been a defensive alliance. We undertake no aggressive behavior towards others. We obey the international rules, whether they're at sea, in the air, on land. We follow scrupulously the Vienna document through the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Therefore, if people don't follow the rules, we should call them out. Is there a sense that this could change? Of course it could change, and we would welcome that change. But I think the example we set is truth and honesty, and by being a member or a part of the rules-based international system ourselves. I think that recent events have demonstrated more than ever how important that is. So, thank you for your attention. And I don't have anybody to hand over to, so I don't know whether you have a break now. Is somebody in charge of the format? I don't know. Okay, thank you.
I'm a columnist with Politico and a senior fellow at Friends of Europe. We've got a great panel for you now on a very important topic, military mobility. What's military mobility? Well, it's about how you actually get the troops and their weapons around Europe, across the oceans, along the railways, over the bridges, to where they need to be to deter and to defend. It's something that used to be second nature during the Cold War. I remember when I lived in Germany in the 1980s, you know, every bridge had a sign on it that told you how many tons of weight it could bear, because everybody was prepared for the possibility that they might have to tear down the barriers in the middle of the Autobahn and make them into runways. or ship tanks across highways that are otherwise used for commuters going to work. But that fell out of fashion at the end of the Cold War, and it was only really after 2014, I would say, after the Russian seizure and annexation of Crimea, that NATO turned its attention again to territorial defense. And one of the questions that raised was, how are we going to get our forces around the continent and across the oceans? That's an environment which has become more difficult in some ways, because for the last 30 years or so, we hadn't dealt with all of those infrastructure questions, but also because it's much easier, paradoxically perhaps, for goods, for families, for tourists, for domestic animals to move around the European Union than it is for soldiers on NATO marching orders, or for their hazardous equipment. So that's one of the big issues which has been identified by NATO and by the European Union. And since 2016, it's been one of the areas on which NATO and the European Union have been working together. Well, we've got a great panel today to talk about these issues. And so first of all, I'd like to welcome from Brussels, European Commissioner for Transport, Adina Vălean. Welcome. From in the room in Bucharest, we have General Bogdan Cernat, who is the commander of the NATO Joint Analysis and Lessons Learned Center. So it's the center which, amongst other things, draws lessons from what happens during NATO exercises. What have we learned about what we can and can't do? And then from Frankfurt, I believe, joining us is General Ben Hodges, retired, the former US Army in Europe commander, and now Pershing Professor of Strategy at the Center for European Policy Analysis, if I'm not mistaken, and somebody who just this year has conducted a major study on military mobility, what needs to be done. And he'll be telling us about some of the lessons he's learned, both in the field and most recently in this study. And last but certainly not least, Tengiz Praladze from the other side of the Black Sea, joining us from Tbilisi. You're an academic, you were the presidential advisor from 2014 to 2018, now senior fellow at the International Center for Geopolitical Studies there in Georgia. And we'll be talking also about the Black Sea region with you, about physical infrastructure, ports, but also pipelines and the various other infrastructure that is vital for military mobility. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to Commissioner Vălean and ask you the first question. What are the EU and NATO doing together to improve military mobility, and how fast is it going? Where have you got to?
Well, thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me to this panel. I welcome the opportunity to exchange with you on the work we are doing to improve military mobility through Europe. We need to be able to launch military movements quickly, which requires greater capacity. Investment here will equip us with more agile defense and deterrence, which I know is important to our NATO allies in the Black Sea region. A word on the region, of course, is a complicated region in terms of political and military interests, and it is right on the EU border with Bucharest, the nearest NATO and EU capital. Every euro spent on enhancing rail and road bridge capacity in Romania and Bulgaria, every euro spent on increasing rail capacity and port docking facilities will affect the speed at which our forces can react, and consequently step up the security for our citizens and businesses in the Black Sea region. Of course, this is not the only region in or around the EU that has NATO members in a geopolitical and strategic position. My comments on military mobility apply to the entire EU. If we are to have an effective alliance on the ground, we need to ensure the unhindered movement of military personnel and assets across our members' borders and territories. This is why the EU has made military mobility a focal point in the cooperation with NATO, as well as in our own internal defense cooperation. Back in 2018, the Commission launched the Action Plan on Military Mobility. This is a document like a roadmap to overcoming the physical, legal, and regulatory barriers hampering the swift movement and transportation of military forces, assets, and equipment within and beyond the EU. It's based on two pillars: the transport infrastructure and regulatory and procedural issues. Under the transport infrastructure pillar, the huge strides we have made in very limited time are testimony to our commitment. The EU member states defined for the first time EU military requirements for transport infrastructure. This was a key step towards the interoperable EU-wide infrastructure for military purposes. We have performed in 2019 a gap analysis to compare these military requirements with the state of play across our trans-European transport network, the so-called TEN-T, which forms the civilian backbone of our EU transport network. And this analysis confirmed, first of all, that the majority of technical requirements for our civilian and military infrastructure are compatible. There is no need for separate networks. Our infrastructure can and will be used for both purposes. Secondly, it revealed that 93% of military mapping needs overlap already with the TEN-T network. This shouldn't come as a surprise because the TEN-T is designed to facilitate large-scale EU-wide flows of passengers and goods, and naturally, it also fits for the military needs. Now that we have a clear mapping of needs and gaps, we are ready to start funding the first dual-use transport infrastructure projects. We'll do this mainly through the Connecting Europe facility, our instrument for financing TEN-T projects. And we have already set aside 1.69 billion euro specifically for military mobility. I emphasize dual use because we'll capitalize on civilian and military synergies. Alongside benefits for the military, the money spent from this budget will also contribute to the implementation of our TEN-T policy and our mobility strategy objectives. Well, these new funds will be allocated following calls for tenders, as we do for traditional funding under the Connecting Europe facility, and we aim to launch the first calls in September. Co-funding will be available for up to 50% of the selected project's costs, or up to as much as 85% for the 15 cohesion states. All EU countries in the Black Sea region are part of this group. And thanks to this leverage effect, we expect to mobilize at least double than the initial 1.69 billion euro budget. Just a word on the procedural and the regulatory pillar of the action plan. We have done some good progress. Thanks to the new EU customs form, which is based on the NATO form, we have been able to simplify and streamline military customs procedures. We are also harmonizing the rules on the transport of dangerous military goods, and our member states are streamlining the process for cross-border movement permission within the European Defence Agency framework. We expect technical agreements for surface and air to be signed by the end of this year. Of course, all these are meant to reduce the administrative formalities and to facilitate swift cross-border military mobility. But the efforts go beyond this mentioned for the action plan. For example, the member states have committed to granting cross-border movement permissions to our military forces within 5 working days. With the process taking up to 30 days in the past, this I think will make a real difference. These are some of the thoughts I had for this.
Let me just pick you up on a couple of points, if I may, Commissioner. So thank you for that introduction. And as you say, there's a lot of activity going on. But the Commission suffered a big disappointment. You originally requested 6.5 billion in the multi-annual financial framework. You ended up, as you said, with 1.69. Where's that missing money going to come from? I mean, 1.69 billion over 7 years. So we're talking, you know, just over a couple of hundred million a year, is not going to buy you an awful lot of dual-use bridges or deep water ports, is it? Where are we going to get the missing money?
Indeed, the member states have agreed on a lower budget than the Commission had proposed. In any case, it is still significant to have 1.69, as it marks the first time that the importance of military mobility for the EU is recognized in its long-term budget, during a time when political attention has shifted to tackling the crisis caused by the pandemic. The budget will, I said previously, will co-fund up to 50% of the project costs through the Connecting Europe facility. Therefore, the total investments in dual-use infrastructure will be at least double in the EU budget. In addition, the member states who are in the end obliged to complete their national infrastructure can use other resources, for example, their recovery and resilience facility allocations. Now we are in the process of receiving the plans, and I'm hoping that the transport networks are going to be supported through these national plans quite substantially. And as I said, the investments in the TEN-T network are also of use for the military mobility. As a matter of fact, I'm aware that some of the Black Sea region member states, including Romania, are willing to use significant amounts of this recovery and resilience facility to improve the transport infrastructure, including the dual-use infrastructure. So in the end, I hope by the end of the day, we can sum up and say a lot of investments were made for the good use of the dual use of infrastructure. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much. I should, after a year and a half of Zoom, I should know when to unmute myself, but the problem is usually when to mute myself, actually. General Cernat, you spend your time looking at what lessons we can learn from NATO's experiences, from from nations, as you call them, experiences. Where have you detected the biggest bottlenecks? What lessons, for example, from Trident Juncture, that big exercise that you did a couple of years ago up in northern Norway? What lessons are you picking up from, obviously exercises have been somewhat muted because of COVID, but where do you see the most important bottlenecks that need to be removed in terms of military mobility?
First of all, good afternoon, and thank you very much for this opportunity to participate in such high-level debate with high-level speakers and distinguished audience. So NATO's Joint Analysis and Lessons Learned Center, it's an integral part of the NATO Lessons Learned capability. So we participate in warfare development and warfighting development, enabling NATO's ability to operate and adapt. So yes, we take part in many exercises. We are charged to collect lessons at some levels that are not available for everyone. So JOLC participates. JOLC as Joint Analysis and Lessons Learned Center participates in many joint exercises of greater importance. And we've seen such lessons that are coming out from these exercises. The problem is for us, lessons is not just an experience. we have to translate these lessons in something that is in favor of our military activity. So we have to inform developments and reviews of doctrines and directives, for example. And exercises are a very important tool to enhance interoperability. And we do this through standards, and of course, standards are very important because these allow us to operate smoothly and with great effectiveness. So from the last major exercises, we can see that there is incompatibility between the infrastructure that military needs and civilian network offers. And of course, there is this because of the priorities that the two sides of the society have. So the military have some requirements for the infrastructure and some priorities, as opposed to the civilian side that have, in many cases, other kind of requirements and priorities. And we can observe very easily, for example, that we use different terminology. And terminology is very important to understand where we are and what are we referring at. So again, terminology, very important point. But I can offer you some examples from the lowest level of activity. So from the practical and or tactical, as you want to say, level, JALC participated in the exercise in the capable logistician series of exercises. And there are a lot of details that the military planners take into account, and these details can, for example, change or make the difference between success or failure. And small details have to be taken in consideration very seriously. And a small example is that signs on the main supply roads. So the main supply routes are filled with military signs to indicate and to support our movement of troops. And there is a lot of things related to these signs, like alphabet, like the position of the signs along the route, and so on. And this is something that we have to address directly through changing standards. And this exercise, capable logistician, so provided us a lot of knowledge and a lot of lessons to address the review and update of more than 80 standards in logistics and movement and mobility. So very important to go to the details. Military work with the details. Details make the difference. So we are very much involved in all these kind of activities, and we are here to help. But our request to our customers is to help us help them. So we can provide analysis, but we need to be supported in this.
Thank you very much. Ben Hodges, if I can turn to you. First of all, you've done this major study with case studies around different parts of the NATO area on military mobility. What were the main shortcomings, bottlenecks that you detected there? And there's something else that we haven't talked about yet, which is at what stage does civilian infrastructure become available to the military in a time of tension, crisis, but not yet wartime? Ben, can I ask you to address that as well, please?
Thanks, Paul. So you've hit on two or three important points. First of all, the military mobility we're talking about is not for the convenience of US or Romanian or German exercises. This is about giving our political leaders options other than a liberation campaign into Lithuania or Romania. So in other words, this is about movement before the crisis actually starts. So peacetime conditions, that means we don't get special access to Deutsche Bahn cargo, for example. All the EU road regulations are still in effect. Most convoys have to move at night through towns with police escort. All of these things are understandable, but they add to the amount of time required to do things, especially the not having access to rail, no special priority, because this is all happening in peacetime conditions. I visited the excellent German National Military Movement Coordination Center in Wilhelmshaven a few years ago, and I was describing my anxiety to a excellent German staff officer there, and he said, "Sir, don't worry. When the crisis is declared, you'll be able to go everywhere you need to go at speed. It won't be a problem." And I was relieved, and then I thought, wait a minute, who declares the crisis? And he said, well, the Bundestag. I'm like, holy hell, it'll never be declared. So that's our challenge, is to move as fast or faster than Russian Federation forces could move. And we have to demonstrate we can do that in peacetime conditions. And right now, unfortunately, we don't have the capacity of rail transport or the trailers that can carry tanks down highways. There's not enough of them to be able to do this. Part of it, obviously, is infrastructure, and I'm really pleased to see Commissioner Vallin here because I did learn, I have to say, I was naive. I spent the first 2 years I was at U.S. Army Europe trying to figure out how was NATO going to solve this problem. And then I realized that almost all of the challenges have to be solved by the European Union or by the nations, because that's where the money is and that's where the authority is. NATO can lay out the requirement, but the nations have to fulfill the, build the infrastructure, make sure that tunnels are wide enough for modern equipment, make sure that bridges can sustain the weight. And your example earlier of the ubiquitous yellow sign that gave the weight classification, those stop in Berlin. There are no signs like that east of Berlin, partly because there never was a requirement for it. And then also Soviet equipment is significantly lighter than is American, British, or German equipment. I think it is important to keep in mind when people are wondering, like, what's the big deal about? And the step one to fixing military mobility is for our elected civilian leaders to acknowledge that there's a threat. If they're not willing to acknowledge that Russia, the Kremlin is really bad and has evil intentions, then legislatures are not going to invest money into improving military mobility, let alone overall readiness. Number two, take a look at what we were all concerned about 6 weeks ago in the Black Sea region. It was endless video of Russian tanks, armored personnel carriers, howitzers, and people wondering, where is the airborne brigade? Where is it at now? All this conventional stuff that supposedly was going away. That's what we were all concerned about, and how impressed we were with how fast Russian Federation forces could move compared to everybody else. Obviously, they're moving on what we would call interior lines, moving inside Russia. So it's a different situation, but that is our challenge.
Well, so as a politician, what you're telling me is that you're asking me to spend a lot of money and give a lot of attention to a problem that may never happen. I can see why it might be a hard sell.
That's the essence of deterrence. I mean, everybody listening to this thing right here pays health insurance and automobile insurance and hoping like hell they never get sick and never have a car wreck. I mean, this is the essence of deterrence, and that's a lot cheaper than having to respond to failed deterrence.
So, you know, we've been at this for a few years now. Commissioner Vallin gave us the steps that the Commission has taken. There's been this project under the EU's permanent structured cooperation led by the Dutch to develop military mobility as well. How are we doing? Are we getting anywhere? What kind of, you know, where are the main things where we need to step up the pace fast, Ben?
Well, first thing is that we have people like Secretary General Stoltenberg, Dr. von der Leyen, heads of state, secretaries and ministers of defense using the phrase military mobility and talking about how important it is. So at least that's progress. And I will say that the Dutch are doing a good job leading the PESCO project on military mobility. You know, the United States, Canada, and Norway were recently approved to join as third-party nations. I don't know why well, I sort of do, but the UK should be joining.
I was going to say the only country missing is the one which gave birth to me.
So so I hope that this.
No comment.
Yeah, no comment. But we do need UK to join this as well. But there's not a room full of Dutch planners solving everybody's military mobility problem. You know, the Dutch, as the PESCO lead, still depend on the nations to do their part to improve or fulfill their responsibility. I tell you what, Paul, one thing that would make immediate impact, and it would give General Chernat lots of more work to do as well, is if the NATO exercise program, if we followed the concept of train to failure, run an exercise that's not preset, where the D-Day is the highlight of the exercise, instead where the enemy's out there and you have to deal with uncertainty and go take it to that point. Otherwise, we will never solve the problems of mission command, the linkages from JFC Brunson, for example, down to multinational corps, Northeast and Southeast. There's still uncertainty about who the NFIUs belong to. And the JSEC that CMC just—
Sorry, you're using a few acronyms there, which I'm sure General Chernat, I can see him nodding in understanding that the rest of us are just a little uncertain.
Thank you, thank you. So
Brunson is a land headquarters.
The NFIU is the NATO Force Integration Unit, which is a series of all the East Flank countries. They're designed to enable rapid reinforcement. But even years after their birth, it's not clear who they report to. Multinational Corps Northeast up in Szczecin, or Multinational Corps Southeast, which will be established in Romania. It's because we've never really exercised to failure. And then the JSEC, the Joint Sustainment Enabling Command that Air Marshal Peach just mentioned previously, that's not in the NATO command structure. And they're still almost 3 years after the agreement to create them, are not at full operational capability because they've not been exercised yet. So that's, if we ran exercises like that, then I think we would be accelerating the pace.
Okay. I'm going to move now specifically to the Black Sea and the challenges of military mobility in the Black Sea region. And I'm going to turn first to Tengiz. Tengiz, obviously, you're on the other side of the Black Sea from the NATO countries, but your country's a NATO partner and enhanced opportunities partner now. What do you see as the main sort of military mobility challenges in the Black Sea region, and how can Georgia help with them? And unmute yourself first.
Thank you so much. It's my great pleasure and privilege to be amongst such distinguished speakers. It's very interesting that we are talking about the Black Sea. Black Sea has really unique history, and it was served both as an interconnector and sometimes dividing line between the East and West. And now we are in the situation when Black Sea still face the challenge and face challenging milestone. Will it be the separation line? Will it be separation line between the West and Russia's spheres of privileged interest? Or it will be interconnector and sea of European cooperation, European prosperity and development. And in that regard, Georgia really has a significant role, because this country is, I would say Georgia is the only country in the South Caucasus so much committed to European and Euro-Atlantic aspiration, with ambitions to join NATO and European Union. and contributing in European security and cooperation. However, today, NATO, despite the fact that finally, and after 2014 Crimea's illegal annexation, NATO started developing a policy towards the Black Sea. However, the unified strategy for long-lasting security is still a long way off. So we have actions, we have some very interesting efforts, but this is not strategy. It's not a vision about the Black Sea development. While the main threats of Black Sea lies beyond the NATO borders, countries like Georgia and countries like Ukraine. So if we look at the map and make like virtual straight line from the north to the south borders of Georgia, it forms a gateway, we could say kind of oxygen corridor for the East-West cooperation, which safeguards economic opportunities and connections for European markets and Asian resources. So if international community accepts shutting down this corridor, it will affect overall prosperity and welfare. That's why talking about Georgia, about mobility, about our common defensibility and so on, yes, I agree absolutely that resilience is the important. I agree that recover from the crisis is very important, but the most important is to prevent crisis. And to prevent crisis, we need action. Action and vision. Vision means, first of all, NATO's vision towards the region, and be brave to encourage countries like Georgia in their aspiration to joining alliance. And I would say that Georgia deserves invitation in the alliance. Encourage Ukraine and support its path to NATO. And the most important thing, encourage cooperation and connectivity of our transport routes. Integration of Georgia in the projects like TEN-T, Free Sea cooperation initiatives are extremely important for our common European security and welfare, of course, because Georgia, once again, it provides access to the Caspian Sea and other countries, and all those corridors and transport communication we are developing, this is beneficial to our European friends.
Yeah. I think you strayed a little bit from the military mobility to the grand politics, but perhaps not surprisingly. If I can drag you back kicking and screaming to the military mobility, you know, in a way, the Black Sea is very much an area which is dominated by Russia and Turkey. Turkey, you know, holds the choke points at the Bosphorus. Russia is has long been the dominant power in the Black Sea region. How does NATO level the score in terms of being able to reinforce the Black Sea region before a conflict?
Before conflict, you mean conflict what we had, or prevent new conflict?
Well, before an East-West war, let's say.
Sure, we have to avoid East-West war, and to avoid that, that means, first of all, cooperation in on all fields. When we are talking about Black Sea security, that's not just an naval operations, because it means air defense, it means ground-based connectivity, and so on. So that's why I'm talking about the infrastructure. Infrastructure, it's not only to transport commodities from east to the west, but it's also effects on mobility. This is interoperability of Black Sea countries. And I think the cooperation what Georgia has with Romania, Turkey, and other NATO member states, that's just a good example how we can cooperate and communicate. But once again, we have to put all is under one big strategy. So we have successes in some direction, but without the strategy and without the clear vision of the future of countries like Georgia and like Ukraine, those efforts are, I wouldn't say that they are useless, they are effective, but less effective. And we are in response regime, so we have to be proactive and develop our agenda and not just respond to Russia's threats and challenges, but develop our positive agenda.
Well, we started a little late and we have time now for questions from the floor. If you're joining us remotely today, then please put your question in the chat box on your Zoom screen, and I will see them. If you're in the room there in Bucharest, please pass your question on to the Aspen staff there, and they will forward them to me in the chat box. So while we're waiting for questions from the virtual space or the physical space, I want to come back to Commissioner Vălean briefly and ask you whether this problem about movement in peacetime, which Ben Hodges underlined, what can the Commission do through EU regulation to make it easier to move forces and equipment around before there is an actual official emergency declared?
It's about movement in our internal market. So
yeah.
To be honest, whatever we are doing, this is at least the interpretation. I don't want to go specific into the military things, even though I can. I've mentioned some of the requirements which constitutes technical or administrative hurdles. But whatever we are doing in transport to have a pan-European transport policy, have free movement of goods and people in the market, and this will absolutely benefit also for other purposes. I was listening to the complaints on the infrastructure, and it's true that if someone looks, and now I'm talking civilian approach, the infrastructure existing, especially on rail, if you look at the maps, you will see that the eastern part of Europe, it's really lacking a lot of, from the investments and the support. It's true that rail is more expensive. We have plans, we have networks in which we'd like to invest, but it depends very much on the willingness of the member states to access the money, to make the investments, to conduct the projects in an effective way. We are asking everyone to complete the TEN-T network by 2030. This autumn, we will come up with a revision of our directive regarding the standards of the TEN-T network. And we will try better to align the rail freight corridors with the road network. So these are things which should help develop the infrastructure. I said there are some technical and administrative hurdles which may require national or EU regulation, then rather large expenditure. Often small regulatory changes can bring also enormous benefits. I can give you some EU example. For example, we have introduced this EU customs form to streamline and facilitate custom formalities for the military. I think this is hugely useful, and this is based on an equivalent NATO form. So now we are now digitalizing this form to reduce the administrative burden even further. Then we have identified that some member states are using divergent national rules for the transport of goods, of dangerous military goods. And now we are trying to harmonize these procedures. So these are, for example, steps we can take at European level. Then now the member states have committed to grant cross-border movement permission at least within 5 working days. They are now streamlining the procedure through the European Defence Agency framework. I mentioned at my first intervention that, we hope to have a technical agreement by the end of the year.
Yeah.
So all these are in times of peace. So
can I ask you
yeah.
a hypothetical question, because it is, you know, what it comes down to. Who decides whether the military or civilian goods get priority on Europe's rail network when we're not in wartime? Is that a national decision? Is it something the Commission would be involved in? Is it a NATO decision? Where does that decision lie?
The decision rests with the member states. That's a fact. That's why we need more cooperation. And in member states, it's one thing, but for the cross-border, we need to have these agreements on technical cooperations and try to harmonize as much as possible. But in the end, the decision rests with each member state.
Right. Thank you very much. We've got a question that's come in from Major General Paul Hermuz, who asks, what should we do to make sure that the strategic military advice will continue to be a must for NATO political decisions? This question of you know, are our political leaders listening to the military advice? General Cherna, maybe you'd like to have take a go at that question. How do we ensure that political leaders take the military advice?
Obviously, the political leaders will rest on assurance coming from the military commanders, and the decision will be based on a very detailed analysis. And analysis comes from a lot of sources and is provided by selected personnel. So the best analysis they will get, the more they will listen. So this is our task, to provide the best analysis possible. And we work together at the strategic level commands to provide our leaders with the most appropriate analysis. But the decision lies in the NATO headquarters. So we can provide analysis, we can provide the reasons, and we can help with the recommendations. But the decision is with the political leaders.
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to ask, I've got another question on that issue of the political and military relations for Ben Hodges. But first, we have a question in the room from Kim Dozier. So Kim, if you'd like to put your question in person, I believe there's a microphone with you now.
Absolutely, thank you. I want to ask a hypothetical to General Hodges and anyone else who would like to dive into it. Russian troops again mass at Ukraine's border in large numbers. Ukraine asks for 5,000 NATO troops, and NATO members say yes. How would you get them there, and what needs to be fixed to make it happen faster?
Hey, Kim, thank you, and thanks after all these years for starting off with a really hard question. Well, first of all, if the alliance agrees to a request as an alliance, that certainly creates some synergies that would be very helpful. Something that we have recommended to our Ukrainian friends is exercises that would require us to move U.S. or some sort of multinational formation from Poland into Western Ukraine, and also from Romania through Moldova up into southeastern Ukraine. So exercise programs that would allow us to find out exactly what needs to be done. I mean, it's not ideal transportation network to get from say Constanța in Romania up into the Ukrainian training areas between Odessa and Mykolaiv. So you have to exercise it. You can't do it just in a simulation. I would like to do the exercise for the exact reason that you talked about. A little bit easier to move from, say, Poland into western Ukraine towards the Ukrainian training area at Yavoriv near Lviv. But whichever one of the challenges is not only crossing borders into a non-EU country, but also the rail gauge is different. So that adds a degree of difficulty as well.
Mm. Well, obviously that's one of those issues where the question of whether exercising the movement of NATO forces into Ukraine would not be seen as a provocation, or would not be seen as changing the status quo on the ground, and might not itself lead to retaliatory mobilization. Ben?
Well, Paul, of course, you were reading the Kremlin's talking points right there. That's exactly how they would try to convey it. But it was there are 80,000 Russian troops in and around Ukraine and still occupying Crimea, still killing Ukrainian soldiers every day or every week since the beginning of the year, despite a ceasefire. So the Kremlin does not need provocation, and we have done excellent exercises in Georgia with American, British troops, armored vehicles, paratroopers there. We have a NATO training mission in Ukraine already. So for sure, we would, and also Ukraine's Navy hosts a great exercise every summer called Sea Breeze. In fact, the largest Sea Breeze ever is going to happen here end of June to July. So I think we need to quit wringing our hands about we might upset the Kremlin. I mean, they don't need provocation. They're killing people in occupying territory illegally on their own without provocation.
Well, it's the first time I've ever been told I was reading the Kremlin's talking points, but I'll pass over that on the basis of our long-standing friendship, and ask you another question. Do you think the Supreme Allied Commander, as things currently set up in NATO, has enough pre-delegated authority to start moving stuff? I mean, military mobility, we can build the roads and the bridges, we can ease the paperwork and speed it up. But if the top soldier in NATO doesn't have the authority to start moving things early on in a situation, then we're running to catch up. What's your feeling on that, Ben? And then I'll ask the same question to anybody else who wants to have a go. Maybe, Commissioner, you'd like it.
Well, for the sake of preserving our long friendship, I didn't say you believed the Russian talking points. I just said that you were using them. No, absolutely not. SACEUR does not have enough authority to do certain things. The deterrence is all about speed of recognition of what's happening, speed of decision, and then speed of assembly. And this is all happening during peacetime conditions. And of course, the Kremlin knows that the alliance needs consensus. They know that the French in particular, but also the Germans and probably a couple of others, will be tapping the brakes the whole time to prevent something from getting out too fast. And so they will maintain ambiguity for as long as they can to make it difficult to understand what's happening, and then therefore to delay decisions. I will say that the Secretary General and the SACEUR, in fact, I'll give the whole alliance credit. It's much faster than I think many people believe, but I think that the SACEUR should have the authority to mobilize the VJTF, for example, to start movement, to begin to do certain things, but doing it with total transparency, with observers to reduce the anxiety level of people on both sides of this. I thought General Chernot's answer to the question earlier about advice was well done. The military actually has plenty of venues to give advice to our political leaders. But what President Obama always complained about was that he never got options. He would be told by the military, Mr. President, this is what you have to do. And the burden's on us to offer options.
Commissioner, do you think that the NATO military needs to have a bit more authority to start moving things early on in a crisis? Or would that be going beyond the European view of civilian control over the military?
No, listen, I wouldn't dare to answer your question.
Ah.
I'm counting on an
That is a very honest answer.
So I prefer to listen on the opinions on my colleagues who are much more directly involved with NATO.
But Tengiz, maybe there is an issue there of how much pre-delegated authority in a democratic society you give to the military, and whether if you don't give it, then you're handicapping your own military, your own side, and what they need to do. But if you do give it, there are concerns about the military somehow leading you into choices that you don't want to have to be faced with. You've experienced this obviously in Georgia in situations of real action. What's your thinking there?
I think that actually that was one of the significant part of our reforms: democratic control and civilian control over armed forces. And I think today, in that regard, I wouldn't say that Georgia is the best in the world, but I think we are on the level of standards required to be a member of alliance, and our performance in this regard is quite well. Sure, once again, I will highlight that democratic control is more than important, especially in countries like Georgia, Ukraine, and other countries, which start their transformation just 20-25 years ago. So I think this path was very significant to our nations and performance. And if we look at the merit-based approach and Georgia's performance, it's really good in this regard.
Great. Well, everybody out there, whether you're in the room or watching us virtually, this is your last opportunity to throw in a question, lob a hand grenade into this debate. Otherwise, I'll go around again and ask everybody to sum up where we go next. I don't see any new questions coming in, so let me start in reverse order. Tengiz, I guess your answer to where we go next is let my people in.
Yes, that's right, sir.
Any other recommendations as to what we should do next?
Actually, our meeting is just 2 weeks before the NATO summit. And it's very, very important to have quite strong declaration language regarding the Black Sea, future of the Black Sea, vision about this region. This is important for Georgia, but this is important for our common European community as well, because we have to, our future is in our hand, and we have to define our future. We have to define strategy of our development.
Great. I'll go back next to Ben Hodges. Where do we go next, Ben? What are the most important things we should do in the coming period?
Oh, thanks. This is right. Exactly the kind of topic that should be addressed here at the summit on 14 June within the context of burden sharing. Instead of so much whinging about what 2%, talk about what do we need from nations to ensure effective deterrence, and if deterrence fails, effective collective defense. And so the idea of host nation support, including proper infrastructure, air and missile defense, provision of fuel, everything else that goes with that, and then cyber protection of transportation infrastructure. In my view, that's just as important as purchasing missile defense systems, because that's the most likely attack we're going to endure in the early days. There's going to be massive cyber strikes against airports, seaports, rail, power generation, and so on. So this ought to be included in a very robust way as part of burden sharing discussion. And I think actually that would incentivize some countries that maybe are a little bit further to the west than Poland or Lithuania or Romania to invest more if we approached it in that way.
General Ternat, is there any discussion in NATO about including this kind of essential dual-use infrastructure, cyber protection, as Ben's just been talking about, and so on, into the 2%? Maybe if we were, you know, the 2% doesn't seem to cover most, you know, of the civilian infrastructure spending, which we are hearing is so important. How about that?
Thank you for the question. It's obviously that the strategic commands, they have a proactive approach. And I can assure you that military mobility receives the right level of attention from the two strategic commands. And we have to notice that this year the allies approved the NATO warfighting capstone concept. So it was an output of the Allied Command Transformation, which is the Warfare Development Command, and is tasked with the transformation of the military instrument of power. And this new concept, together with the concept of deterrence and defense of the Euro-Atlantic area, so provides the best military thinking of our era. So, and of course, the NATO warfighting capstone concept provides a vision for the future development of the military instrument of power. And this includes military mobility. So we address this, and in the future, we will develop a warfare development agenda. And with this, we'll prioritize the capabilities that we need, the most critical capabilities, and we'll allocate the resources necessary to develop these capabilities. And these are including the military mobility. And to take the challenge from the General Hodges, I can say that one of the lines of development inside the warfare development agenda is the audacious wargaming, that concept that precisely address the challenge that General exploit here. So yes, we at the military level, we take the most from the political support in order to develop the military capabilities needed to make the difference in the future between us and the others.
Thank you, General. Before I turn for the final word to Commissioner Valéan, I see Tengiz agitating his fingers and his pen as if he wanted to throw in some final afterthought that had not previously occurred to him. Oh, he agrees. All right, that's all right. We seem to have reached agreement. Perhaps we should seize power. Commissioner, this project is bringing you into very close cooperation with NATO. Where does it go next? What are the next steps? Obviously, you're going to put out the tenders for that money, but in terms of working with NATO, what needs to be done next?
Well, I think, you know, it was already said, because the cooperation to get stronger and stronger, this should be something to be supported. I'm talking about the EU-NATO cooperation. And for this, we need a continuous political dialogue between the NATO and the EU. I think this will be key for advancing the cooperation on mobility, but as well as on other areas, as it was mentioned, like the protection of critical infrastructure, because this is also part of our both our organization job, cybersecurity, very much in connection with mobility, digitalization. So I think all the projects which are mainstreaming right now in the European transport policies are of interest for NATO. I think we can cooperate and share experience and needs. We have close dialogue. I recently briefed the North Atlantic Council and the Secretary General last developments. The Secretary General also attended one of our College of Commissioners last December. But this is just illustrating the excellent relations existing between the both organizations, and behind this there is a lot of technical involvement and good cooperation between services in order to try to design policies for both use, because in the end we share the same values, the same objective, which is a democratic, prosperous and secure transatlantic space, and we are all here to work for this. So these are our next steps. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you, Commissioner Vălean, General Cernat, General Hodges, and to Tengiz Faladze. And I think we've covered a lot of ground today, but we've seen that this is actually one area where this NATO-EU cooperation that is so often called for and talked about is actually starting to work and deliver results. So on that uncharacteristically optimistic note from me, I will pass you back, and I think that's the end of today's proceedings. So there may be some announcements about what you do next for the rest of your day to those of you who are in the room in Bucharest, and I hope that on another occasion I'll be able to be there with you and that we'll all meet together. Thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you.